Franklin Morse slapped the photograph down on the station agent's desk, hard enough to make the ink bottle rattle. "She's nobody," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "A mail-order woman with no family, no money, and a contract with my name on it. You tell her if she's not at my office by morning, I'll have her removed from this town the hard way." Station agent looked at the photograph. A young woman sitting alone on a wooden bench, her small suitcase at her feet, snow gathering on the window behind her. It was Christmas Eve. Morse tucked his coat and walked out into the cold without a second thought, as though he hadn't just described a human being like a piece of unclaimed luggage. If you've ever been left somewhere and truly realized, that not one person in that place knew your name, then you already understand what Elena Whitaker felt in that moment. And if you've never felt that, stay with this story, because what happens next will change how you see the word home forever. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow Elena's journey all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Train had been running 4 hours late out of Cheyenne, which meant Elena Whitaker arrived in Coldwater Creek, Wyoming on the evening of December 24th with stiff fingers, a headache from the coal smoke, and the particular kind of nervous energy that lives in your chest when you're about to meet the person who is supposed to become your husband. She had rehearsed the moment so many times in her head that it had begun to feel like a memory rather than something still ahead of her. She would step onto the platform. He would be standing there, Caleb Thornton, 34 years old, a man who ran cattle on 200 acres east of town and who had written her 7 letters over the past 5 months, each one careful and polite and just warm enough to suggest something more. She would recognize him from the photograph he'd sent. He would recognize her. They would shake hands. It would be awkward. She had prepared for awkward. What she had not prepared for was the platform being empty. Not just sparse empty. The other passengers from the train filtered past her, greeted by faces she didn't know, pulled into arms she had no claim to. A woman in a red coat was kissed by a man in a sheepskin jacket. 2 children ran shrieking toward a grandfather who crouched down and caught them both at once. A group of men from the cattle cars headed straight for the saloon at the end of the street, their voices already loud and loose. Elena stood on the platform and watched all of it, and kept her face very still, because she had learned early in life that showing fear in a strange place was never safe. She waited 20 minutes, then 30. The station master came out twice to look at her and went back inside without speaking. Lamps along the platform were lit against the early dark, and snow had started coming down, not the picturesque Christmas Eve snow from the cards you bought in the city, but the real Wyoming kind, fine and sideways and mean. 45 minutes. She went inside and asked the station master if anyone had come asking for a woman named Whitaker. He was a tired man with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had seen too many variations of this particular situation to feel much about it anymore. "Nobody came in asking for anything," he said. "You got somewhere to be?" "I was supposed to be met," Elena said, "by a man named Caleb Thornton." Something shifted in the station master's face. It was small, just a tightening around the eyes, but Elena had spent 26 years learning to read the small shifts in people's faces, because those were usually the ones that told the truth. "Thornton," he said, "from the East Range." "Yes." Looked down at the ledger on his desk. "Train schedules posted on the board outside," he said. "Next eastbound is day after tomorrow." That was all he said. Didn't look up again. Elena went back to the bench on the platform and sat down. She put her suitcase between her feet and her handbag in her lap, and she looked at the door at the end of the platform, which led out to the main street of Coldwater Creek, and she thought, very carefully, about what she knew and what she didn't know. She knew. She had 43 cents in her handbag. She had a return train ticket that was dated for 6 months from now, because the agency had structured it that way you couldn't simply leave, because the ticket was dated far enough out that leaving meant either staying or buying a new one, and a new ticket east cost $4.20, which she did not have. She had a letter from the Westward Hearts marriage agency confirming her placement with one Caleb Thornton of Coldwater Creek, Wyoming, and a photograph of a man she had never met standing in front of a fence post, squinting slightly into the sun. What she didn't know, why he hadn't come, whether he was injured or delayed, or whether something far simpler and far worse was true. She sat with not knowing for another hour. Then 2. By the time the platform lamps were burning low and the station master had locked the ticket window and left without speaking to her again, the snow was coming down in earnest, and Elena Whitaker understood, with the quiet clarity that comes from finally running out of other explanations, that Caleb Thornton was not coming. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not at all. She had been 26 years old for 3 weeks. She had traveled 840 miles. She had sold her sewing machine and her good winter coat to help cover the travel costs the agency hadn't paid for. She had packed her whole life into one medium-sized suitcase and crossed the country on the word of a man she had never met, and he had not even come to tell her he'd changed his mind. She sat in the dark of the empty train station on Christmas Eve, and she did not cry. She had learned that crying in front of no one was still crying in front of yourself, and she wasn't ready to let herself fall that far yet. She did instead was think. The Westward Hearts Marriage Agency had an office in town. She'd been given the address in her welcome papers. It would be closed tonight, obviously. But in the morning she would go there and find out what happened. There had to be an explanation. There had to be some kind of procedure for this. The agency had a responsibility. They had taken money from both sides of this arrangement, hers and Thornton's, and surely they had some obligation when one party simply failed to appear. She told herself this until she almost believed it. Then she found the cheapest option she could, which was a room above the feed store for 35 cents a night, rented from a woman named Mrs. Paulson, who looked at Elena's single suitcase and her too-thin coat and her very careful face and said nothing that needed saying. The room was small and cold and had a window that faced the alley. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Coldwater Creek celebrating Christmas Eve without her. She thought about her mother, who had died 2 years ago, and her sister back in Pennsylvania, who had 3 children and a husband, and very little space for a 26-year-old woman who needed somewhere to be. She had not come west because it sounded like an adventure. She had come because she had run out of other options, and because 7 letters from a man named Caleb Thornton had made her believe, for the first time in a long time, that there might be a place for her somewhere. She held the photograph of him and looked at it for a long time in the lamplight. Then she set it face down on the nightstand, lay down on top of the quilt without undressing, and made herself sleep. Westward Hearts Marriage Agency occupied a narrow office on the main street of Coldwater Creek, wedged between a land surveyor and a hardware store. Up, it had a sign in the window with a painted heart that Elena might have found charming under different circumstances. She was there when the clerk unlocked the door at 8 in the morning, still wearing the same dress from the train, her hair pinned back with more precision than she felt. Clerk was a young man, probably no older than 20, who had the look of someone who had been put in charge of something he didn't fully understand. When Elena explained the situation, her name, her contract number, the fact that Caleb Thornton had not met her at the station, he wrote things down in a ledger without making eye contact, and then excused himself to go into the back room. Back there for a long time. When he came out, he was followed by a man Elena had not seen before. This man was somewhere in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with a quality of deliberate stillness about him that was immediately more unsettling than aggression would have been. He wore a good coat. He had the kind of face that had probably once been handsome and had since become merely authoritative. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "I'm Franklin Morse. I run this office." "Mr. Morse," Elena said. "I need to understand what happened with my placement and what the agency intends to do about it." Morse sat down at the desk across from her without asking her to sit, so she sat anyway. He opened a file that the clerk had apparently brought from the back. He looked at it for a moment, the way people look at things they already know the contents of. "Mr. Thornton dissolved his agreement with the agency 6 weeks ago," Morse said. The floor did something odd under Elena's feet. Not literally, but that was how it felt. 6 weeks ago," she repeated. "That's correct. And the agency didn't notify me." Morse looked at her over the file. "The agency made several attempts to reach your previous address." "I had already left," Elena said. "You knew my forwarding address. It was in my paperwork. There may have been a clerical. I received a letter from this office 3 weeks ago," Elena said, "confirming my travel arrangements. Someone here knew how to reach me 3 weeks ago." Pause. Morse set the file down. Something in his expression settled into a kind of professional flatness that was worse than irritation. "Be that as it may," he said, "the situation stands as it is. You've arrived in Coldwater Creek. Mr. Thornton is no longer a party to any agreement. And you are, as I understand it, without means to return east." "I'm aware of my situation," Elena said, What I'm asking is what the agency plans to do about it. Agency fulfilled its contractual obligation, Morse said. Placement was arranged. The failure of the placement was Mr. Thornton's doing, not ours. Elena looked at him. She thought about 7 letters. She thought about her sewing machine. You arranged a placement with a man who had already withdrawn from the agreement, she said. Put me on a train 800 miles across the country. We're compensated for travel costs. Partially. Contract specifies partial compensation. The contract, Elena said carefully, also specifies that the agency will act as a representative on behalf of the woman in the event of a placement failure. I have the language memorized, Mr. Morse, because I read that contract 4 times before I signed it. Just a moment. Something moved behind Morse's eyes. Something that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. He had not expected her to know the contract. Then the flatness came back. That clause applies to placement failures that occur prior to travel, he said. You were already in transit. That interpretation is not in the document. That is the agency's interpretation, Miss Whitaker. He stood up, which was meant to communicate that the conversation was finished. I understand this is a difficult situation, but I'm afraid there isn't much we can do for you at present. If you'd like to leave your new address with the clerk, we can reach out should a suitable new placement become available. Elena did not stand up. I arrived in this town last night, she said. On Christmas Eve. I sat alone in an empty train station for 2 hours because no one thought it was important enough to write me a letter. I have 43 cents and nowhere to go, and you are telling me there is nothing you can do. Morse picked up his coat from the back of his chair. I'm telling you the agency's position. I'm sorry for the hardship. Walked into the back room and closed the door. Elena sat in the chair across from the empty desk for a long moment. Young clerk was looking at his ledger with great concentration. Then she stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. She found work that first day, or thought she had. A woman who ran a boarding house on the east end of town agreed to let Elena help with laundry in exchange for a room. Elena worked for 6 hours, boiling sheets and wringing them out in the cold back room until her hands were red and her arms ached. At the end of the day, the woman told her that the arrangement would start properly after the new year and sent her away. She tried the hotel, which needed no one. She tried the diner, which had a full staff. She tried 3 different dry goods stores, 2 of which turned her away immediately, and 1 of which let her speak to the owner long enough for him to determine that she had no references from anyone in Coldwater Creek, at which point the conversation was over. The problem was not that Elena was unqualified. She could cook, sew, keep accounts, manage a household, had 4 years of teaching experience at a small school back east. The problem was that she was an unknown woman with no local connections, no husband, and no explanation for her presence in town that didn't involve the word abandoned. And in Coldwater Creek in 1882, that word followed a woman around like a smell. She heard it on the 2nd day. A woman at the dry goods counter said it to her companion while looking directly at Elena. That's one of them mail-order girls. Failed ones end up drifting around town until they're desperate enough to take whatever's offered. Elena continued examining the thread on the counter as though she hadn't heard. She put the thread down because she couldn't afford it and walked out. On the 3rd day, she used her last 20 cents on a meal at the diner and ate it slowly at the back table, and tried to think of who else she might approach and what she might say that she hadn't already tried. It was on the way back from the diner that Franklin Morse found her. Not by chance. She understood that immediately. He was leaning against the post outside the feed store where she was still renting the small room, and he had the look of a man who has timed his arrival deliberately. Miss Whitaker, he said. A word. She stopped. She did not say anything. I've been thinking about your situation, he said. He made it sound generous, like he'd done her a favor by spending any thought on her at all. And I think there may be a path forward, if you're open to it. I'm listening, she said. There's a man in this county who's looking for a wife, Morse said. He's willing to take on a woman who's already been placed and didn't work out. Some men aren't particular. Elena looked at him. What man? His name is Driscoll. He runs a property south of here. She had heard the name. In a town this size, you heard names quickly. Driscoll was not a name that came attached to anything reassuring. 2 men at the boarding house who'd talked past her in the hallway had used it once, and one of them had lowered his voice when he did. I'm not interested, Elena said. You might want to think about it more carefully, Morse said. The agency spent money bringing you out here. That's a debt, Miss Whitaker. Not a large one, but it exists. And a woman in your position, with no income and no references. Agencies spent money it agreed to spend as part of a contract that it then failed to honor, Elena said. That's not a debt I owe you. Morse tilted his head slightly. I disagree. And I have lawyers who will disagree on paper, which tends to be more useful than disagreeing out loud. He paused. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to offer you a practical solution. Driscoll isn't everyone's first choice, but he's a solution. You have a roof and a name and standing in this town. I'd like you to leave me alone, Elena said. Think about it, Morse said. Pushed off the post and straightened his coat. You've got until Friday. After that, I'll need to move on this another way. He walked away. Elena stood in the cold for a moment, looking at the middle distance, then went inside and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought very hard about what another way might mean, not and whether she was afraid, and concluded that yes, she was afraid, and that being afraid didn't change anything, and that she had until Friday. Tuesday. She spent Wednesday talking to anyone who would stand still long enough. Not begging she was not capable of begging, or at least not yet, but asking. Asking if there was work. Asking if someone knew of a family that needed help. Asking at the church where she did not go inside, but stopped at the steps to speak to an older woman who was shoveling snow off the walkway. The older woman's name was Martha Ellison. She was 70 if she was a day, and she had the eyes of someone who had seen Coldwater Creek when it was still just a claim post and a dream. You're the mail order girl, Martha said. It wasn't unkind. It was just accurate. I am, Elena said. Martha leaned on her shovel and looked at her. Morse send you to Driscoll yet? He tried. Martha made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Always tries, it's how he works. Brings girls out, botches the placement, then offers to fix the mess himself for a price. She paused. 3 others before you. 2 took what he offered. 1 left. How did the one who left manage it? She had a sister in Denver with a husband who worked for the railroad, Martha said. Got word to her, and her brother-in-law came up and put her on the train himself. Elena did not have a sister in Denver or a brother-in-law with railroad connections. She thanked Martha and walked back toward the main street. On Thursday, she ran out of money for the room. Mrs. Coulson, to her credit, said she could have 1 more night, but would need to be gone by morning. She said it without looking at Elena directly, which meant she felt bad about it, which meant Elena thanked her and meant it. Thursday night, she sat on the edge of the bed in the cold room and allowed herself, for the first time, to fully understand the shape of the situation. No money, no room after tomorrow morning, no employment. No return ticket that was usable. A man who was planning to move on this another way starting tomorrow, and whose other way she could make some educated guesses about. And in the morning it would be Friday. She thought about her options. She thought about each one carefully, and honestly, the way you have to think when you can't afford to lie to yourself. Then she put on her coat and sat down and waited for morning. Friday arrived the way bad days often do, quietly. With weak sunlight, looking almost ordinary. Elena was at the Westward Hearts office when Morse arrived. She had decided the night before that whatever was going to happen, she was not going to let it happen to her in a back room somewhere. She was going to be in a public place in the middle of the morning where people could see. Morse looked at her when he unlocked the door and didn't seem surprised. Made a decision, he said. I have, she said. My decision is that I'm not going to marry Driscoll. Stepped inside. He held the door open in a way that was technically an invitation, but felt more like a net. Come in out of the cold. I'll stay here, she said. He let the door close behind him and turned to face her through the glass. Then he opened it again. Something in his expression had shifted. The professional flatness had acquired a harder edge. Miss Whitaker, he said, I've been patient. I've tried to give you options. But you are in breach of your contractual obligations to this agency. You have no money. You have no room. And you have nowhere to go. If you won't accept a solution, I'm going to have to involve the county sheriff in the matter of your outstanding debt. There is no outstanding debt, Elena said. There is a document that says otherwise. A document you wrote. A document you signed. Morse stepped out onto the walk. He was no longer bothering to keep his voice down, and the 2 men at the corner had turned to look. I have been more than generous. I am giving you a last chance to be sensible about this. Elena looked at him. She thought about the bench at the train station. She thought about the 3 days of walking through this town and every door that had closed. She thought about Martha Ellison leaning on her shovel. I signed a contract, Elena said, loudly enough for the men at the corner to hear. with an agency that put me on a train 8 days after the man I was supposed to marry had already canceled his agreement. Guy arrived in this town on Christmas Eve with no money and no information and no help. I have been here for 4 days, and Mr. Morse has offered me nothing except a forced marriage to a man I have not chosen, and a threat of the sheriff when I declined. She looked at the men at the corner. I would like whoever hears this to know that that is what is happening here. Morse's face did a complicated thing. For a moment she thought he might grab her arm. She tensed for it, but they were in the middle of the street, in the middle of the morning. And a woman had just spoken loudly enough to draw attention. And even Franklin Morse apparently knew that some things were better done in private. "You are making this very difficult," he said, quietly now, through his teeth. "You made it difficult first," she said. She did not know what would have happened next if the wagon hadn't turned the corner at that exact moment. But it did. It was a ranch wagon plane, working, with the look of something that covered a lot of miles, pulled by 2 gray horses that moved with the particular patience of animals who had learned not to rush. On the seat was a man she didn't know, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a coat that had seen hard winters and a face that was all angles and tiredness and something watchful behind the eyes. He had slowed because of the scene. That was clear. He was looking at Morse, then at Elena, then at Morse again, with the expression of a man doing a quick calculation. 4 children in the wagon bed behind him. The oldest was maybe 12, sitting with his arms crossed and his jaw set. The younger 3 were arranged around a pile of crates, 2 girls, and a boy watching the street with the wide cataloging eyes of children who have learned to pay attention to things that adults think they don't notice. The man on the wagon seat looked at Elena one more time. Then he set the brake and climbed down. He was taller than she judged from the wagon, several inches over 6 feet, and he walked with the slightly deliberate gait of someone with an old leg injury that he decided not to let matter. Stopped between Elena and Morse. Not aggressively, not touching either of them, but placing himself in a way that changed the geometry of the moment. "Morning," he said to Morse. His voice was level. "This is a private matter, Mercer," Morse said. "Didn't look private." Mercer glanced at Elena. "You all right?" Nobody in Coldwater Creek had asked her that in 4 days. The question was so ordinary and so unexpected that for a moment she couldn't answer it. "Not entirely," she said. Mercer nodded, as if not entirely was a perfectly complete response. Looked back at Morse. "Problem with the lady's contract? Stay out of it. What's the debt amount?" Morse stared at him. Said stay out of it. "I'm asking what you say she owes you," Mercer said. "'Cause if it's a number, it's a conversation. If it's not a number, then it's something else." He said it without inflection, without threat, the way a man says things when he doesn't need to threaten, because the facts are doing the work. Morse looked at Elena, then at Mercer, and then at the small crowd that had gathered in the way small-town crowds do not obviously, but entirely. "This isn't finished," Morse said. It was aimed at Elena. "I'll note that," she said. Morse went inside. The door clicked shut with exaggerated quiet. Elena looked at the man standing beside her. Up close he was older than she'd first thought. Or maybe just more worn. There were lines around his eyes that spoke more to weather and worry than years, and his hands on his coat lapels were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly. "Wyatt Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch 12 miles out." "Elena Whitaker," she said. "I've got 43 cents in a suitcase." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but something in that vicinity. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" She thought about the room she didn't have anymore, and Mrs. Paulson's careful non-gaze and Friday morning, and the shape of what another way was likely to mean. "No," she said. Mercer turned and looked at the wagon, where his 4 children were watching with undisguised attention. The oldest boy had uncrossed his arms. The youngest girl was standing up in the wagon bed, holding the side rail. "My wife passed 8 months ago," Mercer said. He said it plainly. The way people say things, they've had to say often enough that the saying of it no longer breaks them, though what happened after might. 4 kids, ranch that's too much for 1 man and not enough for 5 people, as it currently stands. He paused. "I've got a spare room, and I could use someone who knows how to manage a household. That's all I'm offering. No contract, no obligations, no Morse." He looked at her. "Be free to leave whenever you wanted." Elena looked at him. She thought about the bench. She thought about 840 miles. She thought about the word abandoned and how it had followed her around this town like weather. She picked up her suitcase. "Then I'd like to come," she said. Mercer nodded and reached out his hand and took the suitcase from her before she could protest. and carried it to the wagon. And that was the first thing he did for her. And it was such a small thing. And she was so tired. She almost lost the careful expression she'd been holding for 4 days. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. The 4 children regarded her with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. The boy's jaw was set again. The youngest girl sat back down and studied Elena with the frank intensity only small children and very old people can get away with. Mercer climbed up beside her, released the brake, clicked the horses forward. Coldwater Creek fell away behind them, and the wind came up cold off the open range. Gaunt Elena Whitaker sat on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and looked at the miles ahead and told herself that she had survived 4 days. She would survive whatever came next, and she did not let herself think about how much she wanted to cry. Youngest girl, who was 4 years old and had apparently decided that suspicion was inefficient, climbed over the crates and sat down next to Elena without asking permission and leaned against her arm. Elena looked down at her. The girl did not look up. She just stayed there, leaning as if she had been doing it all her life. Elena Whitaker, who had sat alone on a cold bench on Christmas Eve waiting for someone who never came, put her arm very carefully around that small, warm shoulder. Then the wagon rolled out into the white Wyoming morning. For the first time in 4 days, something in her chest let go. Wagon ride to the Mercer Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and Elena spent most of it learning the children without asking their names directly, because asking directly felt like pressing on something that wasn't ready. Youngest, the girl who had climbed over the crates and leaned against her arm, was called Lily. Elena learned this because at about the 40-minute mark, the second youngest boy, who was 6, said Lily, "Stop staring." And Lily said, "I'm not staring. I'm looking," with the conviction of someone who had given this distinction serious philosophical consideration. 6-year-old's name came out shortly after when Wyatt said, "Without turning around, Danny, leave your sister alone," in the flat tone of a man who had said those exact words several thousand times. The other girl was 9. Her name was Ruth, and she sat in the back of the wagon reading a book with the deliberate focus of someone who had decided not to participate in whatever was happening around her. She had her mother's coloring. Elena guessed dark hair and serious eyes, and she glanced up once to look at Elena with an expression that was more assessment than curiosity, and then went back to her book. The oldest boy did not speak at all. He sat at the far end of the wagon bed with his back against the side rail, looking out at the range passing behind them. His name was Cole. Elena knew this not because anyone said it, but because of how the absence of his name sat in the wagon, the way everyone's attention kept moving around him. The way even Lily's chatter had a slight redirect when it got too close to whatever Cole was carrying. 12, she estimated, maybe just turned 13. He had his father's jaw and his father's watchfulness, and something else in his eyes that was all his own, something that had gone careful and hard in a way that 12-year-olds' eyes shouldn't be. Wyatt drove and didn't talk much, which she didn't take as unfriendliness. Had the quiet of someone who had spent a lot of time alone in open country and had made a kind of peace with silence. Once, when the wagon hit a rut and she grabbed the seat rail, said sorry without looking over. Just a reflex. She said, "I'm fine the same way." And that was the most they exchanged for the last 40 minutes. Ranch appeared out of the flat white country, the way things appear in Wyoming all at once. No gradual approach, just the land, and then suddenly a cluster of structures that meant people lived here and were trying to keep on living here. Main house, low and long, with a covered porch that ran the full front length. Barn that was bigger than the house and in better repair. 2 outbuildings, a hay shelter, a corral with 4 horses shifting in the cold. Was not a pretty ranch. It was a working one, which was a different thing entirely. Everything about it said functional in capital letters and comfortable in very small ones. Porch railing had been repaired with mismatched timber. The house had been painted once, a long time ago. Look, there was a kitchen garden gone to winter straw along the south side, and someone had piled the season's last firewood against the east wall with enough care that they'd obviously been thinking about February. Wyatt pulled up and set the brake, and the children unfolded themselves from the wagon bed in their various ways. Danny jumped straight off the back and landed in a crouch. Lily climbed down carefully, testing each foothold. Ruth dog-eared her page, closed the book, and descended with the air of someone completing a necessary interruption. Cole was off the wagon and walking toward the barn before anyone else had fully organized themselves, and nobody called him back. Wyatt came around to Elena's side and held out a hand. She took it and stepped down. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the sitting, and she didn't entirely hide the wince, but he didn't mention it. Carried her suitcase up the porch steps and held the door open. Inside was warmer than outside, which was not the same as warm. Main room had a fireplace that had clearly been burning earlier, but had died down to embers. Furniture was sparse and functional, a table with 6 chairs, 2 of which didn't quite match, a horsehair sofa that had seen better decades, a sideboard with a collection of mismatched crockery. There were no curtains on the windows. There was a braided rug in front of the fireplace that had been good once and was still serviceable. On the mantel there was a photograph. A woman, mid-20s, sitting straight and unsmiling in the way people sat for photographs in those days. But with something in the set of her eyes that suggested the unsmiling was effort, that smiling was the more natural state. She was holding an infant Lily, Elena guessed, which would have made the photograph not quite 2 years old. Elena looked at it for only a moment, then she looked away. Room's down the hall, Wyatt said. Last door on the left. It's not much. It was, in fact, not much. A narrow bed, a washstand, window facing east, a wooden hook on the wall for hanging clothes. But it had a door that closed, and it was hers. And after 4 nights in the room above the feed store, she felt about it the way other people felt about hotel suites. It's fine, she said. Thank you. He nodded and left her to settle in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her suitcase and thought, well, just that. Well, as in here you are. As in this is where the road went. As in you are a 26-year-old woman with 43 cents and a suitcase in a stranger's ranch house 12 miles from the town that didn't want you. And this is for now, what there is. She unpacked her suitcase. She hung her spare dress on the hook. She set her comb and her small mirror on the washstand. She put her book, a battered copy of David Copperfield that she had carried for 6 years, on the windowsill. Then she went out to figure out what needed doing, because sitting still had never been something she was good at. In the kitchen, from what she'd seen passing through, it looked like a room that had been surviving rather than being managed. She was right about the kitchen. It had the particular quality of a space that competent people had been using, without joy, everything functional, nothing organized, the kinds of small accumulations that happen when nobody has time or energy to think about systems. Flour in a canister without a lid. Salt and sugar in unlabeled crocks that were clearly distinguished by whoever lived here, but would be a guessing game for anyone new. Dutch oven, with what appeared to be the residue of last night's meal still in it, sitting cold on the stovetop. Elena built the fire up and put the Dutch oven to soak and started taking inventory. There was enough in the larder to work with. Not abundance winter on a working ranch was never abundance, but enough. Dried beans, side pork, a sack of cornmeal. Onions hanging in the cold room still good. Some root vegetables that were starting to lose their confidence, but hadn't quit entirely. Tin of molasses. She was elbow deep in the organization of the dry goods shelf when Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. "What are you doing?" Lily said. It wasn't quite a question and not quite a challenge, just the straightforward inquiry of a 4-year-old monitoring a new variable in her environment. "Sorting out where things are," Elena said. "They're in the same place they always are." "I know, I'm learning where that is." Lily considered this. "Papa puts the cornmeal on the left." "That's where it's going," Elena said, which was not entirely true. She'd been planning to put it on the right, where it would be easier to reach, but she put it on the left. Lily came into the kitchen and climbed onto one of the chairs at the table and watched. She had a rag doll with her that was missing one button eye and had clearly been loved to within an inch of structural integrity. "That's Bess," Elena said, nodding at the doll. Lily looked surprised, then pleased. "How do you know?" "I guessed. Her name is Clara." "Clara," Elena said. "Good name. She had a button," Lily said, touching the empty space on the doll's face with one finger. "Fell off when Mama was sick and Papa said he'd sew it back, but he forgot." She looked at the doll for a moment. "Papa forgets things now." Elena kept her hands moving, kept her face neutral. "I can sew it back," she said, "if you find the button." Lily looked up. "You can? I taught school for 4 years. Sewing's easier than school." Lily slid off the chair immediately and went to find the button with a sense of mission that suggested the button's location had been known all along, and it was simply a matter of someone offering to use it. Dinner that evening was beans with side pork and cornbread, and the last of the root vegetables made into a broth that wasn't elegant, but was hot and filling, and tasted like actual intention rather than the desperate improvisation Elena had eaten for the past 4 days. Danny ate with the focused efficiency of a 6-year-old who has discovered hunger. Lily ate approximately 40% of her food and spent the rest of the time feeding small pieces of cornbread to Clara under the table. Ruth ate carefully and read 4 pages of her book between bites until Wyatt said Ruth, and she sighed and closed it. Cole did not come to the table. There was a silence around this fact that had the particular quality of something that happened often enough to have a shape. Wyatt set a plate aside without comment. Danny looked at the empty chair once and then went back to his beans. Lily appeared not to notice, though Elena suspected she noticed everything. After dinner, Wyatt took the plate down the hall to Cole's room. Elena heard the knock, heard the door open, heard the low exchange of voices, nothing clear. Just the register of a conversation that was short and careful and did not end in anything that sounded like resolution. Came back and sat down at the table with his coffee and didn't explain, and Elena didn't ask. She had been at the ranch for 6 days when Franklin Morse sent a letter. She knew it was from him before she opened it, because Wyatt brought it in from the post with the particular expressionlessness of someone holding something they suspect is unpleasant. She opened it at the kitchen table while the morning was still early, and the children were not yet up. The letter was 1 page, in a precise hand, and informed her that the Westward Hearts Marriage Agency maintained its position that she was in violation of a contractual obligation, that her current residence did not constitute a legal resolution of this matter, and that Mr. Morse would be visiting Coldwater Creek's county courthouse in the coming weeks to explore legal remedies. She read it twice, then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and turned back to the stove. Wyatt was watching her from the doorway. He'd come in for coffee and caught the last part of the reading. "Morse," she said. It wasn't a question. "Figured," he said. Came in and poured his coffee and sat down. He did not ask what the letter said, which she appreciated, because she wasn't sure she could explain it without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. "Going to claim I owe the agency money," she said anyway. He's probably going to argue the contract gives him some kind of authority over my placement." "Does it?" "Not in any legitimate reading of it." She paused. "Legitimate readings require someone to make them in front of a judge, and judges in frontier counties sometimes have particular ideas about women and contracts and what reasonable looks like." Wyatt drank his coffee. He looked at the middle of the table. "What do you need?" The question was so direct, it caught her off guard. "I don't know yet," she said. "When you do, tell me." She looked at him. He was looking at the table still, in that way he had of seeming to pay attention to things that weren't in the room, or maybe to several things at once. "Why are you helping me?" she said. It came out more raw than she intended. Looked up at that. "Because Morse is a fraud, and you needed somewhere to be," he said. "And my kids needed someone who could keep this house from falling into the floor." He said it simply, without any performance of virtue. Like it was arithmetic. She nodded. She turned back to the stove. She had been turning things over in her mind since the first night who Wyatt Mercer was, what his help cost, whether she was trading one dependency for another. But the arithmetic he just described was accurate, as far as she could tell. He needed help. She needed safety. Neither of them was pretending it was something else. That was, she thought, more honest than most arrangements she'd encountered. The children found their own pace with her, each at their own rate. Lily had decided within the first afternoon that Elena was acceptable and had extended this into a kind of proprietary interest. She appeared wherever Elena was working and offered opinions and occasionally help, and had presented her with the button for Clara's eye on the second day and watched with fierce attention while Elena sewed it back on. Danny warmed up through food, as 6-year-old boys often do, and by the end of the first week he was bringing her things a particularly interesting rock. A piece of harness leather he thought might be useful. A list of his top 5 opinions about horses, delivered with the gravity of a congressional report. Ruth was slower. Ruth was a reader and a watcher, and she had the habit of quiet observation that often signals either great trust or great caution, and in Ruth's case it was probably both. She spoke to Elena in full sentences from the start, politely and precisely, but it was conversation more than connection, the kind of talking that doesn't let anything through that wasn't already decided to go through. On the 8th day, Elena found Ruth in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, sitting at the table with a candle, writing in a small notebook. Elena stopped in the doorway. Ruth looked up. Something flickered across her face, not quite guilt, because she hadn't been doing anything wrong, but the instinct of someone who is used to keeping private things private. "I wake up early," Ruth said. "I come here so I don't bother Cole." "You share a room?" "Used to. He moved to the room at the back after Mama died. Ruth looked at her candle. Doesn't sleep much. Elena came in quietly and put the kettle on. She sat down at the other end of the table. With her own work, she'd been mending a split in one of Danny's shirts in the evenings, and she'd brought it down. She didn't ask about the notebook. Ruth kept writing for a few minutes. Then what was it like where you came from? Pennsylvania, Elena said. Crowded green, wet compared to this. Why did you leave? Elena considered the simplest true answer. I needed somewhere new. Ruth looked at her directly for the first time in 8 days, in a way that was different from the assessment look, a look that didn't have a calculation behind it. Cole thinks you'll leave, she said. He thinks everyone leaves. Elena kept her hands moving on the shirt. What do you think? Ruth considered the question with the seriousness she gave to everything. I think it's too early to know, she said. That's fair, Elena said. Ruth went back to her notebook. Elena went back to the shirt. Outside, the Wyoming dark was just beginning to consider becoming gray. Cole was a different problem, and she was honest enough with herself to use that word. Not that he was a bad person, there was nothing in him that was bad. It was a 12-year-old who had lost his mother 8 months ago and was conducting his grief by making himself as self-sufficient as possible, which in practice meant helping his father with the ranch from before sunup and making it clear that he did not need anything from anyone and was not going to be caught hoping for it. He was polite to Elena in the way that is worse than rudeness, because you can work with rudeness. Politeness with a locked door behind it gives you nothing to push against. She did not push. She learned what Cole did, and she made sure those things were not interfered with. He handled the horses every morning, fed, watered, checked their feet, and she never went to the barn during that hour. He had a system for splitting the kitchen firewood that was slightly different from what she would have done, and she didn't change it. He sat at the far end of the table at meals, and she did not try to draw him into conversation. Just let the conversation happen around him the way conversation does in a room where people actually live. On the 10th day, she was in the yard hanging the wash, not the most pleasant task in Wyoming January. The alternative was damp clothes, which was worse when Cole came around the side of the house and stopped short, as if he'd expected the yard to be empty. Started to turn away. Cole! He stopped. Can you reach the top of that line for me? My arms aren't quite long enough and I keep dropping the far end. She held up the sheet. It was true she was 5'4" and the line was strung for someone taller, and she'd been fighting it for 10 minutes. He looked at the sheet. He looked at her. Then he came over without saying anything and took the far end of the sheet and clipped it to the line. Thank you, she said. He nodded and started to leave. Your father strung this line too high for anyone under 6 feet, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement that a smile was somewhere in the vicinity. He knows it's too high, Cole said. Ma always said she was going to get him to lower it. He stopped. Corner of his mouth went still. He just never did. There it was. That specific quiet that follows the accidental saying of something you weren't ready to say. Elena clipped the other end of the sheet and didn't look at him. I'll ask him to lower it, she said, practically speaking. Don't tell him I said anything about it, Cole said. I won't. He went back around the side of the house. Elena turned to the next sheet in the basket and pretended she wasn't aware that something had just moved, something that had been stuck, something that had shifted exactly as much as it was ready to shift and no more. Wyatt came to her 3 days later, with the look of a man who has been turning something over and finally decided to say it. They were both in the kitchen. She was doing the account books, which she'd quietly taken over after discovering that Wyatt's bookkeeping method appeared to be remember most of it and write down the rest in a way only he could interpret, and he was sharpening a draw knife at the table. Morse came by the feed store in town this week, he said. He was looking at the draw knife. Talked to Phil Garrett, who asked about me. Asked whether I had a woman staying here. Elena set down her pen. What did Phil say? Phil's a decent man. Said he didn't involve himself in other people's domestic arrangements. Wyatt set the draw knife down. But Morse is making a case. He's saying you're evading a legal contract. Got Driscoll interested, not as a husband anymore, apparently, but as a partner in whatever he's planning legally. Driscoll has money, Elena said. Driscoll has money and a grudge. Someone told him what you said in the street. Wyatt looked at her. Public statement thing. He didn't like it. She thought about Friday morning, the middle of the street, her own voice loud enough to carry. She didn't regret it. But she could see how it had changed the shape of things. Morse is going to the courthouse, she said. Probably. Contract is not valid, she said. I've been through every line. Agency failed to notify me of a material change to the agreement. Voids their claim. You'd need to make that argument in front of someone, Wyatt said. I know. She picked up her pen again, but she wasn't looking at the books. Do you know a lawyer in the county? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. There's a man in Hatchfield. James Cotter. He's handled some of my land business. He paused. It's not cheap. I have 43 cents, Elena said. Came out with a kind of wry flatness that she hadn't entirely intended, and Wyatt looked at her with an expression that was not quite amusement, but was something in the same neighborhood as respect. I'll cover the costs, he said. Consider it back wages. Don't owe me wages. I've been here less than 2 weeks. I've organized my pantry, fixed 4 pieces of equipment I'd been ignoring, tutored Danny in his multiplication tables, sewn Lily's doll back together, and done the accounts in a week, what would have taken me all winter, he said. I owe you wages. She didn't have a good argument against that because it was accurate. All right, she said. I'll write down what the contract says and what I believe the legal position is. You can take it to Cotter and see if he agrees. We'll both go, Wyatt said. It's your case. She looked at him. He was picking up the draw knife again. Done with the conversation the way people are done with conversations, when they've said the thing that needed saying and the rest is details. She went back to the accounts. They rode into Hatchfield on a Thursday, the 2 of them, on the ranch's 2 better horses. Lily had protested the departure with impressive volume, and Ruth had silently made herself responsible for Danny and Lily's morning without being asked. And Cole had just looked at the horses being saddled with an expression that said he understood this was serious and was running his own private calculations about it. James Cotter was a dry, thin man in his 50s who had the manner of someone who had heard every variety of frontier legal trouble and was prepared to hear several more before he retired. He listened to Elena explain the situation, the contract, the timeline, Morse's letter, the circumstances of her arrival without interrupting, except to occasionally say, in a way that communicated processing rather than reaction. When she finished, he read the copy of the contract she'd made. He read it for a long time. This clause, D, he said finally, tapping a line near the bottom, about material changes to the placement agreement, saying they failed to notify you when Thornton withdrew. I'm saying they sent me a letter confirming my travel arrangements 3 weeks after Thornton withdrew, Elena said. I have the letter. Cotter looked at Wyatt, then back at Elena. Have the letter? Yes. That's good, he said. That's quite good, actually. He set the contract down. Morse has made claims like this before. He tends to target women who don't have anyone to advocate for them. He's managed to make 2 prior situations resolve in his favor, but those women didn't have documentation and didn't push back publicly. I pushed back publicly, Elena said. I heard, Cotter said, and there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction if he'd been a less contained person. Driscoll's involvement complicates it financially, but the legal merits are on your side if that letter says what you're describing. Says what I'm describing, Elena said. Cotter looked at both of them over his desk with the expression of a man making a private assessment. This is going to take a few weeks to run through the proper channels, he said. Morse will get a response from my office in the next few days, and he will not like it. There may be a formal hearing. He paused. In the meantime, Miss Whitaker, you should know that your position is stronger the more stable your situation appears. A woman living and working in a legitimate household, contributing to a family and community, is harder to paint as a vagrant debt avoider. She's not a vagrant, Wyatt said. There was an edge in it that wasn't there in his regular voice, quiet and very final. I know that, Cotter said simply. I'm telling you what Morse's argument will be and why the current arrangement is strategically sound. He looked at Elena. Stay where you are. Keep records. Don't speak to Morse without me present. He stood up. And bring that letter next time you come. They rode back in the gray afternoon light with the kind of quiet that means 2 people are each thinking about the same problem from different angles. Cold was working its way through Elena's coat. It was a better coat than the one she'd sold, but not by much, borrowed from the ranch's collection of miscellaneous winter gear, and she was keeping her shoulders pulled in against it. Halfway back, Wyatt said, Cotter's right about Morse. Done this before, I know, Elena said. Martha Ellison told me. Wyatt glanced at her. Martha talks. Martha sees things clearly, Elena said. She's been watching that town for 50 years. She knows what's real. Quiet for a moment. She knew Margaret, he said. Margaret, his wife's name, said plainly, without the careful avoidance that people sometimes used around the names of the lost. Ray went to the same church when Margaret was a girl. Elena didn't say anything. She let the name sit in the cold air between them. She was sick for 4 months before she died, Wyatt said. Said it the way he'd said it in town. That first day, the cadence of a man who had found a way to carry a fact that was too heavy to put down. Kids took it hard, differently, each of them. He stopped. Cole took it the hardest. Because he's the oldest, Elena said. Because he's like her, Wyatt said. He feels things the same way she did. Very deep and very quiet and doesn't know how to put it anywhere. He looked at the range ahead of them. He thinks if he needs something, it'll get taken away. So he decides not to need things. Elena thought about the clothesline. About the fraction of almost smile. About don't tell him I said anything about it. Come around, she said, in his own time. I know, Wyatt said. I'm just not always patient enough. He said it without excuse or self-pity, just as a fact about himself that he was aware of. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her since she arrived. She thought about what it was to be this man 35, alone on 12 miles of Wyoming range, with 4 children at 4 different stages of grief, a ranch that needed 2 people to run it properly and currently had 1 1/4, dead wife's photograph on the mantle, and a legal problem he'd inherited by stopping a wagon in front of a scene that wasn't his business on a January morning. Thank you, she said. For stopping, he looked at her briefly, a sideways glance. You'd have found a way out, he said. Maybe, she said. Eventually, yeah, he said, eventually. The ranch came up out of the flat gray land ahead of them. Smoke from the chimney roof had kept the fire up. As they rode into the yard, the door opened and Lily came out in her coat with one boot unbuttoned and the other not on at all, which suggested she had heard the horses and departed before preparations were complete. You're back, she announced, as though this were a matter of some personal achievement on her part. Back, Elena said, and climbed down from the horse. Nah. Lily grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the house and began an immediate and comprehensive account of everything that had happened in their absence, which appeared to include Danny putting a frog in Ruth's boot, disagreement about whose turn it was to feed the chickens, and a major development in Clara's fictional life that required substantial exposition. Elena let herself be pulled. She looked back once at Wyatt, who was unsaddling the horses with the ease of long habit, his breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. He looked up and caught her looking and did not do anything in particular, just held her eye for a moment before turning back to the horse. 'Twas enough. Not a promise, not an answer to anything she'd been asking herself in the quiet of the narrow room at the end of the hall. Just a man, a yard, and smoke coming from the chimney of a house where children were alive and arguing about frogs, and the particular cold quality of Wyoming light that made everything look harder and simpler than it really was. She went inside. Franklin Morse's letter was still in her apron pocket, folded into quarters. She took it out and put it on the table next to the account books, smoothed flat where she could see it. She was not going to be afraid of a piece of paper. She was going to read it clearly and think about it clearly and deal with it the way you dealt with things when you had run out of the luxury of panic. She sat down, pulled the accounts back toward her, picked up her pen. Outside, the Wyoming wind was working at the corners of the house the way it always did out here, testing, finding the weak points, looking for something that might give. The house had been standing 30 years and it didn't give. Neither, Elena Whitaker had decided, was she. Cotter's letter reached Morse's office on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the whole of Coldwater Creek knew about it in the way small frontier towns know about things, not because anyone announced it, but because the clerk at Morse's office had mentioned it to his wife, who had mentioned it to 2 women at the dry goods counter, who had between them mentioned it to approximately everyone else. Elena heard about it from Martha Ellison, who appeared at the ranch on Thursday afternoon in a buckboard driven by her grandson, a 17-year-old who seemed to have been told to wait outside and did so with the patience of someone who knew better than to argue with Martha about anything. Martha came inside and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the kitchen with the evaluating eye of someone who had run her own household for 50 years and was conducting an honest appraisal. Better than it was, she said. Wyatt's a decent man, but he never could manage a kitchen. He manages fine, Elena said. He's just been doing too many other things at once. Martha looked at her over her coffee cup. That's a diplomatic answer. It's an accurate one. Martha made the sound that served her as acknowledgement and set her cup down. Morse got Cotter's letter. He's angry. The kind of angry where a man starts doing things he would otherwise be too cautious to do. Kind of things. He's been talking to Judge Aldrich. Martha said the name with a specific flatness that communicated a full paragraph's worth of information. Aldrich handled both of the other cases, Morse ran. He's not corrupt exactly. He's just the kind of man who has a picture of how things work and doesn't examine it very carefully. Elena poured her own coffee and sat down across from Martha. Cotter aware of the relationship between Morse and Aldrich? I expect Cotter's aware of most things in this county, Martha said. Whether he can do anything about it is a different matter. She paused. Driscoll was at Morse's office Wednesday morning. Stayed 2 hours. What does Driscoll actually want? Elena said. Not the official version. What does he actually want? Martha considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Driscoll's been trying to buy Wyatt's east pasture for 2 years, she said. Wyatt won't sell. That pasture runs along the creek, and whoever holds the creek access controls the water for about 4 other properties. Driscoll wants it badly enough that he's been looking for leverage. Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at the account books she'd been working through before Martha arrived. Wyatt's land records, the lease agreements, the boundary survey from 1878. She had been reading them, partly because it was her job to know the ranch's situation, and partly because something had felt slightly off in the way the numbers organized themselves, a gap she hadn't been able to locate yet. Thinks I'm leverage, she said. You're useful to him, Martha said, which was the same thing said more carefully. Morse can make a legal case that creates trouble for Wyatt, that makes the ranch look complicated, contested, associated with some kind of scandal or legal mess. It's easier to pressure Wyatt to sell. Wyatt doesn't know about the pasture connection. Wyatt knows Driscoll wants the land, Martha said. I don't think he's connected it to you yet. She picked up her coffee. I'm connecting it for you now. Elena sat with this for a moment. Outside, she could hear Danny in the yard attempting to teach one of the ranch dogs a trick that the dog appeared to have no interest in learning. The ordinary sound of it was a kind of anchor. Thank you, she said. I'm not being charitable, Martha said, not unkindly. Watched Mort's do this 3 times. I'm tired of watching it. She finished her coffee, declined a second cup, left in the buckboard with her patient grandson. And Elena sat at the table for a long time after, looking at the account books with new eyes. She found what she was looking for that evening, after the children were in bed and Wyatt was doing the last check of the barn. She had gone back through the survey records and cross-referenced them with the county land register pages Cotter had given them copies of, and there it was not obvious, not a screaming error, but a quiet inconsistency in the boundary notation of the east pasture that placed the creek access in a slightly ambiguous position. Not Wyatt's doing. The survey was from before he'd owned the property. But the ambiguity was there, and in the hands of someone who wanted to use it, it was the kind of thing that could generate years of legal dispute. When Wyatt came back in, she showed him. He sat down and looked at the pages and said nothing for a full minute. I knew the survey was old, he said finally. I didn't know there was an issue with the creek boundary. There might not be a legal issue, Elena said, but there's enough ambiguity that someone could argue one. And if Morse and Driscoll are working together, that's probably part of the plan. Create enough legal uncertainty around the property that you're easier to pressure. Wyatt looked at the survey. His jaw had the set she'd come to associate with him, processing something he didn't like. The situation with you is part of that. I think it might be, yes. She paused. I'm sorry. I didn't know when you helped me that. Don't apologize for that, he said. His voice was not sharp, but it was very clear. Driscoll's been trying to find an angle on that pasture since before you ever got on a train. He looked at her. This isn't something you brought. It's something he was going to find eventually. She appreciated that. She wasn't sure she entirely believed it, but she appreciated it. We need to tell Cotter about the survey ambiguity, she said, and about Driscoll's interest in the land. He needs the full picture. We'll go Monday, Wyatt said. He looked at the survey for another moment. Then he got up and put his coffee cup in the basin and said goodnight and went down the hall to his room, and Elena stayed at the table a while longer, looking at the boundary lines on the page and thinking about how much damage could be done with a small, quiet inconsistency, and how much depended on someone noticing it before someone else had the chance to use it. Morning before they were to go to Hatchfield, Morse came to the ranch. He came with Driscoll. This was the first time Elena had seen Driscoll in person, and he was not what she'd imagined. She had pictured someone loud or obviously hard. Instead, he was a man in his mid-40s, well-dressed for a rancher, with a careful stillness and a way of taking up space without moving much. He was taller than Morse and considerably broader, and he had the manner of someone who made decisions about other people's property the way other people chose which road to take, without much moral weight to it. Came in a good buggy, which meant they'd planned to look like official business. Wyatt saw them from the barn and came across the yard without hurrying. Elena was on the porch, and she stayed there. Morse stepped down from the buggy. He looked at Wyatt, and then at Elena, and his face arranged itself into something that was trying for reasonable. "Mercer," he said. "Good morning. We've come on a matter of county business." "You're not county business," Wyatt said. "You run a marriage agency." Driscoll stepped down beside Morse. He nodded at Wyatt with the nod of a man greeting a social equal or performing the greeting of one. "Wyatt," he said, "don't make this unfriendly. We're just here to talk." "Then talk," Wyatt said. Morse looked at Elena. "Miss Whitaker, I'm here to inform you that a hearing has been scheduled before Judge Aldrich for the 14th of February regarding your contractual obligations to the Westward Hearts Agency. You'll need to appear or have legal representation present." "She has legal representation," Wyatt said. "James Cotter." Something shifted in Morse's eyes. Not surprised Cotter's letter had already told him that, but a recalibration. "That's her right," he said smoothly. "Of course." He paused. "I also want to say, as clearly as I can, that there are ways to resolve this without the expense and disruption of a formal hearing." Miss Whitaker were willing to— "No," Elena said from the porch. Everyone looked at her. "Whatever the offer is," she said. "No." She came down the porch steps. "You had your opportunity to resolve this reasonably, Mr. Morse. You chose letters and lawyers and a hearing before a judge who has ruled in your favor twice before. You've made your decision about how this works. I've made mine." Morse looked at her with an expression that had given up on reasonable and was working with something colder. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." "You put me on a train," Elena said, 8 days after my placement had been dissolved. Without telling me. "You left me sitting in an empty train station on Christmas Eve with 43 cents and nowhere to go, and then you tried to hand me over to a man I didn't choose like I was unclaimed luggage. You don't get to tell me what's hard." Driscoll had been looking at the East Range during this exchange. Now he turned back. "Mercer," he said, in a tone that was trying to separate this into a different conversation, "doesn't have to involve your ranch in any way. Woman's legal situation is her own. If you want to walk away from it clean, that's a simple matter." "I'm not walking away from anything," Wyatt said. "The boundary survey on your east pasture has some questions attached to it," Driscoll said. He said it casually, the way you say something you have been waiting to say. "I had a surveyor look at the records last month. There's an argument to be made about where your property ends and the public land begins along the creek. It would be easier for everyone, for you, for your family, if that question was settled quietly between neighbors rather than in a courtroom." Yard went very still. Wyatt looked at Driscoll for a long moment. His face was doing nothing visible, and Elena had learned enough about him in 3 weeks to know that the nothing visible was the thing to watch. "You had a surveyor look at my land records," Wyatt said. "Public records," Driscoll said. "Anyone can look." "True," Wyatt said. "Anyone can also look at the 1,876 territorial land grant that established the eastern boundary of this property, which I have a notarized copy of in my house, because my father was careful, and I learned from him." He paused. "And anyone can talk to James Cotter about what happens when you make fraudulent claims about someone else's land." Driscoll's calm developed a hairline crack. It closed quickly, but Elena saw it. Morse stepped in. "Nobody's making fraudulent claims. Simply, you should leave," Wyatt said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performed. It was the voice of a man on his own land speaking a fact about what was going to happen. Morse looked at Elena. "February 14th, he said. "Be there." "We'll be there," she said. They got back in the buggy. Driscoll took the reins with the deliberate ease of someone demonstrating that they were not rattled, though the demonstration itself was the tell. Buggy turned and moved back down the track toward the main road. Wyatt watched until it was 100 yards out. Then he said quietly, "I don't actually have a notarized copy of the 1,876 grant." Elena looked at him. "I have the grant," he said. "It's not notarized." "I need to find out if that matters." "It probably matters," Elena said. "Yeah," he said. "We'll ask Cotter Monday." He turned and went back to the barn. Elena stood in the yard for a moment, watching the buggy until it disappeared. Cold was very precise this morning, the kind of February cold that had given up trying to be anything other than what it was. She went inside and added 1,000. 876 territorial grant notarization to the list she had been building in the account book's back pages, and put the pen down again and went to make breakfast. Because it was 7:30 in the morning and 4 children were going to be hungry regardless of what Franklin Morse was planning. Cole found her in the barn that afternoon. She was there on a legitimate errand. One of the bridles had a cracked throat latch that she'd noticed the day before. She'd found out a piece of suitable leather in the tack room and was making the repair. But she was also there because she needed an hour away from the house and the lists and the cold calculation of the situation. And the barn was the place on the ranch where things were most simply themselves. The horses, the hay, the smell of both, sounds of large animals being at rest. Cole came in from the back and stopped when he saw her. But he didn't leave. He went to the stall where the gray mare was his horse. She'd understood that by the second week and began brushing her with the automatic ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. For a while there was just the sound of bristles and the mare shifting her weight. "What are they going to do?" Cole said. Elena didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Going to try to argue in court that I owe the agency money and have to do what they say," she said. "Going to argue that their contract is invalid." "Who decides?" "A judge." Cole was quiet, brushing the same section of the mare's flank twice without seeming to notice. "What if the judge sides with them?" "Then we appeal," Elena said. "Or we look for another option. It's not over at the first decision. Could go wrong." "Yes," she said, "it could." She looked at him. He was looking at the mare. "Cole," she said, "are you asking because of the legal case or because you want to know if I'm leaving?" His hands stilled on the brush. He didn't look at her. "Both," he said. It came out smaller than he probably wanted it to. She put down the bridle. "I don't know what the judge will decide," she said. "I can't promise you anything about the courthouse. But I can tell you that I'm not looking for a reason to leave. I'm not waiting for this to be over so I can go somewhere else." She paused. "I came here because I needed somewhere to be. But I'm staying because this is a place worth being. Because your father is a fair man, and your sisters are remarkable, and Danny is going to drive me completely crazy, and I am unreasonably fond of all of you." She said it plainly, without making it into a speech. That's the honest answer. Cole looked at the mare for a moment longer. Then he looked at Elena, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he held the look instead of pulling it back. "Okay," he said. It was one word, but the locked door had moved just slightly on its hinges. Went back to brushing the mare. Elena went back to the bridle. Outside, the afternoon light was going thin and gold, the way February light did when it was trying its best. Then the ranch settled into its particular early evening sounds, Danny calling for the dog. Ruth's voice inside the house, reading aloud to Lily, the horses moving in their stalls. She finished the repair and tested it and hung the bridle back on its hook. As she was leaving, Cole said, without looking up, "Put the cornmeal in the wrong place." "Lily told me left," Elena said. "Lily doesn't cook," Cole said. "Ma kept it on the right. I always thought left was wrong." Elena looked at him. "I'll move it right tomorrow." "Ah." He nodded. She went out. The Monday trip to Hatchfield was longer than the first because a cold front had moved in overnight and the road was hard going in the gray early morning. Wyatt drove and Elena sat beside him. Then they went through what Cotter needed to know the survey ambiguity. Driscoll connection, visit to the ranch, 1,876 territorial grant. Cotter listened with a yellow pad and a pencil, and the expression of a man for whom a clear legal problem is something close to professional satisfaction. When they were done, he looked at his notes for a moment. "Grant matters," he said. "Whether it needs to be notarized depends on how it was originally recorded with the territory. I'll need to see it. But if it says what Wyatt thinks it says about the boundary, then Driscoll's surveyor argument is smoke." "In the contract case?" Elena said. "Your case is strong," Cotter said. "Your letter is the key document. But Aldrich is the complicating factor. Not corrupt, I want to be clear about that, but he has a habit of reading ambiguity in a particular direction." He tapped his pencil. "I need to establish the pattern. Morse has done this before. Both prior cases. If I can show the court that this is a method rather than a dispute, it changes the character of it." "Can you get records from the prior cases?" Wyatt asked. "I can request them," Cotter said. "Whether those women want to be involved is another question." He looked at Elena. "Stronger your own documentation is, the less I need them. Either of them is willing to testify to the pattern that would be significant." Elena thought about Martha Ellison at the church steps, leaning on her shovel. Two took what he offered. One left. I might know how to find out, she said. Martha knew. Of course Martha knew. Martha appeared to know everything that had happened in Coldwater Creek, going back to approximately the founding of the territory, and she produced the information with the same unhurried certainty she brought to everything. One of the two women who had accepted Morse's terms was a woman named Clara Voss, who now ran a millinery shop in Hatchfield itself, not the marriage Morse had arranged, but a subsequent one, made on her own terms after she'd gotten clear of the Driscoll situation and saved enough to start the shop. She was, Martha said, not someone who had been broken by what happened. She was someone who was very careful about who she talked to and why. Elena wrote her a letter. She kept it short and honest. Her name, her situation, what Cotter was trying to establish, and the question of whether Mrs. Voss would be willing to speak to a lawyer about her own experience with the agency. She said at the end, in plain language, that she understood if the answer was no, and that she would not contact her again if that was her choice. She gave the letter to Martha to deliver, because it would be received differently coming from Martha than from a stranger. 3 days later, a note came back. It said, "Come to the shop on Thursday morning. Come alone." The millinery shop was on a side street in Hatchfield, small and well kept, with a window display that showed the kind of careful taste that comes from having very little margin for error. Elena went in at 9 in the morning and found a woman behind the counter who looked at her the way people look at each other when they are trying to determine, quickly, whether trust is possible. Clara Voss was in her mid-30s, with a composed face that had clearly once been more open and had become more guarded through the exercise of necessity. She was attractive in the way competent women often are not from effort, but from something intrinsic that had survived or had tried to reduce it. She said nothing for a moment after Elena came in. Just looked. "You're the one who stood in the street," Clara said. "Yes," Elena said. "I heard about it." Something moved in Clara's face. "I thought about doing that," she said. "When it was me. She stopped. I had nowhere to go. I almost didn't," Elena said. Someone stopped his wagon. Clara looked at her for another moment. Then she came around the counter and locked the front door and turned the sign to closed and said, "Sit down. I'll tell you what I know." She told it in a businesslike way, without much ornamentation, with the manner of a woman who had made peace with what happened by understanding it clearly rather than by setting it aside. Morse had arranged her placement. The man had withdrawn, as Thornton had withdrawn from Elena's. She had arrived to no one. Morse had offered Driscoll. She had accepted, because at the time she'd had no one like Wyatt Mercer, and no one like Cotter, and no letter as documentation. "Marriage to Driscoll happened," Elena said. "It was filed," Clara said. "Driscoll never actually." She paused, choosing the word. "Wanted the arrangement on paper, for what it did for him legally with property claims. That actual marriage was not something he was interested in." She looked at the counter. "I was in that house for 4 months before I understood what I was there for. When I left, he didn't come after me, because he'd already gotten what he wanted from the county records." Elena was very still. "He used the marriage to make a legal claim on property. On water rights," Clara said. "His wife's property, which was mine, technically, for 4 months included an access easement that he needed for a grazing dispute." She looked at Elena. "I don't know the details of what he's planning with you and the Mercer Ranch. It's not about you. It's never been about the women." Elena thought about the survey, the creek boundary, east pasture. "Will you talk to Cotter?" she said. Clara looked at the locked door, at the window where her hats were displayed with careful attention, at the life she had built slowly and on her own terms. "Yes," she said, "but I need something in writing from Cotter first, about what I'll be asked and what won't be made public that doesn't need to be." "I'll get that to you by next week," Elena said. Clara nodded. She stood and unlocked the door. "The other woman," Elena said. "Second one. Do you know if she'd speak to him?" Clara's expression shifted slightly. "Her name is Agnes Fulton. She married Driscoll's foreman. She's in Coldwater Creek." A pause. "She hasn't talked about it to anyone, not even her husband." She looked at Elena squarely. "I'm not telling you to approach her. I'm just telling you she exists." "I understand," Elena said. "Thank you." She walked back to where she'd tied the horse and stood for a moment in the February cold, thinking about what Clara had just told her and what it meant and how it rearranged the shape of what Morse and Driscoll were actually doing. It wasn't about women who couldn't pay a debt. It was about a method: bring a woman west, strand her, offer her a solution that included a legal record. Use that record for whatever property maneuver Driscoll needed at the time. Clean it up, move on, do it again, 3 times. She was the 4th. She untied the horse and mounted and rode back toward Coldwater Creek with the wind coming at her from the northwest, cold and direct and factual. She thought about February 14th and Judge Aldrich and what Cotter could do with Clara Voss's testimony and a notarized land grant and a letter sent 3 weeks past the withdrawal of a placement. She thought about Agnes Fulton in Coldwater Creek, married to Driscoll's foreman, not talking about it. She did not go to Agnes Fulton directly. She went to Martha Ellison. Martha listened without interrupting. She sat in her kitchen with her own coffee and the particular stillness of someone organizing information against what they already know. Agnes is not unhappy, Martha said when Elena was done. Her husband is a decent man. She's made a life. She looked at her coffee. She's also not someone who has forgotten what it cost her to get to where she is. She paused. D. You're not asking her to blow up what she has. You're asking her to tell the truth about something that happened before what she has. That's right, Elena said. Martha was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to her, she said, not you, me. She looked at Elena. She says no, it's no. We don't push, I know, Elena said. I know exactly how it feels to be pushed. Martha looked at her steadily for a moment. Then she nodded once, and that was that. February 14th was 6 days away when Cole came to find Elena in the kitchen at 7 in the morning with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the closed-off, careful look, not the ghost of almost smile, but something urgent and young and frightened in the way 12-year-olds are frightened when something is wrong and they don't know how to say it in the right order. There's a man at the east fence, he said, with survey equipment. I was there yesterday, too. I didn't say anything because I thought it was county business. He looked at her. But I went and looked at what he was marking, and he's marking inside our property line. Elena set down what she was doing. Where's your father? Checking the north pasture. He'll be an hour out. Show me, she said. They went out together in the cold, Cole moving fast across the frozen ground, in the way young people moved when they decided to do something, Elena keeping pace. East pasture was a 20-minute walk from the house, and when they got to the fence line, she could see the man middle-aged, methodical, driving small flagged stakes into the ground with a mallet. He had placed 7 stakes. They were 20 yards inside the property line, as Elena understood it from the survey records she had been reading for 3 weeks. She called to him across the fence. Who hired you? Man looked up. He had the face of someone doing a job, not conducting a fight. County Surveyor's Office, ma'am. Who requested the survey? Looked at his papers. Filed by a Mr. Driscoll, contesting the eastern boundary of this property. Elena looked at the stakes. 7 of them, each one placed with the patient confidence of someone who expected them to stay. Pull them up, she said. The man blinked. Ma'am, I have a county filing. You have a contested filing on a property whose owner has not been notified and has not consented, she said. And you are currently placing survey markers on land whose boundary is established by a 1,876 territorial grant that supersedes any subsequent county filing. If you leave those stakes in the ground, you will be the first person named in the legal response. She paused. I'm going to recommend you pull them up and go back to whoever hired you and tell them what I said, and that our lawyer's name is James Cotter, and he is aware of this situation. Man looked at his stakes. He looked at Elena. He looked at Cole, who was standing at the fence with his arms crossed and his jaw set, which was a particular expression that apparently ran in the family. Started pulling up the stakes. Elena watched until all 7 were out of the ground. Then she turned and walked back across the pasture toward the house, and Cole walked beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Did you really know all that? Cole said. About the territorial grant superseding the county filing? I've been reading your father's land records for 3 weeks, Elena said. I was a school teacher. I know how to read a document. Cole was quiet for another few paces. Are you scared? He said. Question came out genuine, the way questions come out when someone has decided to stop performing and just ask. Elena considered being reassuring. Then she decided Cole deserved honesty more than reassurance. Yes, she said, but scared doesn't mean wrong. And wrong doesn't win just because it's confident. Cole looked at the ground in front of them. Ma used to say something like that, he said. Different words. But like that. Elena didn't say anything. She let it sit, the way you let things sit when they're fragile and true and don't need anything added to them. They came back to the house. Lily was on the porch looking for them, with the specific concern of a 4-year-old who has noticed that people left and wanted to confirm they came back. We're gone a long time, Lily said. We had something to take care of, Elena said, came up the steps and took Lily's hand. And they went inside together, and 6 days later it would be February 14th. Franklin Morse had no idea how much the ground had shifted under him while he was busy being certain of himself. Wyatt came back from the north pasture to find Elena in the kitchen, writing a 4-page letter to Cotter, and Cole sitting at the table watching her write it with the expression of someone who has decided to be present for something important. Wyatt stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room. "What happened?" he said. It wasn't a question. Elena told him about the surveyor while she kept writing. She described the 7 stakes, county filing, what she'd said, the man pulling them up and leaving, kept her voice even and factual, and did not look up from the letter. Because if she looked up, she might say something she hadn't decided to say yet about how her hands had been shaking on the way back across the pasture while she'd kept them very still at her sides, so Cole wouldn't see. Wyatt listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You told a county surveyor to pull his stakes," he said. "I told him the legal basis on which the filing was contestable and suggested he remove them," she said. "He made his own decision." Wyatt looked at Cole. Cole looked at the table, but his mouth had the shape of someone suppressing something. "She knew about the territorial grants superseding the county filing," Cole said, with the tone of someone delivering a fair report. "I've been reading your land records," Elena said, still writing. Wyatt pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the letter taking shape under her pen. "What are you telling Cotter?" "Everything. Stakes, the filing date, Driscoll's name on it, what the surveyor said, when it happened." She turned the page. "Also that we need the original grant document in Hatchfield before February 14th, and that if the county surveyor's office received a fraudulent or misleading filing, we may want to raise that separately from the contract case." "That's 2 legal actions," Wyatt said. "That's what he's running," Elena said. 2 actions. The contract case to control me, the survey dispute to pressure you. They're coordinated. So we respond to both." Wyatt was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than waiting to speak. "Been in my house 6 weeks, he said. 7, she said, without looking up. 7 weeks, he said. "And you know my land records better than I do. You've been running a ranch and raising 4 children and managing winter alone," she said. "I haven't had time to read your own documents, I have." She looked up then. "That's why I'm here, Wyatt. That's what I can do. Let me do it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, and she went back to the letter. Cole, she noticed from the corner of her eye, had put both elbows on the table and was watching his father with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the watchful guardedness, not the carefully maintained distance, but something that looked like a 12-year-old quietly updating a long-held conclusion about something. Martha's conversation with Agnes Fulton happened on a Wednesday 5 days before the hearing. Elena knew about it, only because Martha sent a note through her grandson. She'll talk to Cotter. Alone, no courtroom, which meant she wouldn't testify. But she would give Cotter information he could use to build the shape of the case, even if her name stayed out of it. It was not everything. It was more than nothing, and in the current situation, more than nothing was significant. She brought the note to Cotter on Thursday, when they made the trip to Hatchfield with the original land grant found in a tin box at the back of Wyatt's desk. Not notarized, but properly witnessed and recorded with the Territorial Land Office in a way that Cotter said, with visible professional satisfaction, was entirely sufficient. Cotter read Martha's note. He read the grant document, set both down on his desk, and laced his fingers together, and looked at the space between Elena and Wyatt with the expression of a man who is revising his assessment of the odds upward. "This is a stronger position than we had 2 weeks ago," he said. "What's our weakest point?" Elena said. Cotter appreciated the question. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his posture. He was a man who respected people who asked about weak points rather than only wanting to hear about strength. "Aldrich," he said. "He will be fair technically, but he interprets ambiguity conservatively. And there are 2 small ambiguities in the contract language that Morse will lean on: notification clause and the definition of placement failure." He looked at Elena. "I need your letter. The one confirming your travel arrangements." She took it from her bag and put it on his desk. She had been carrying it with her since the day she'd arrived at the ranch, folded in the same apron pocket where she'd carried Morse's threat letter, which was also now in front of Cotter. He read both. He read Elena's copy of the original contract. Turned back to the travel confirmation letter. "This was sent from the agency's Coldwater Creek office," he said. "Yes. Signed by the clerk, yes. 3 weeks after Thornton's withdrawal." He set it down. "Morse is going to claim the clerk sent it in error. It was an administrative mistake. That's possible, Elena said. Cotter said. But administrative mistakes that put a woman on a train 800 miles and then offer her a forced remarriage to a man with a history of using those arrangements for property fraud, that pattern is harder to characterize as innocent error. He looked at both of them. What I'm going to argue is that the notification failure was not an accident, but a practice. In Clara Voss's willingness to speak to me privately, combined with what Agnes Fulton has apparently told Martha Ellison, gives me the outline of that practice, even if I can't put both women on a stand. Is that enough? Wyatt said. Cotter considered the question honestly. It's enough to raise the question in front of Aldrich. Whether Aldrich chooses to engage with it fully is a different matter. He paused. But here is what I want you both to understand. The goal on February 14th is not necessarily to win everything in one day. It is to make the record. If Aldrich rules against us on any point, we appeal, and on appeal we have a record that shows the pattern clearly. He looked at Elena. This is not a situation that resolves in one morning. I know, she said. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. I've been prepared for the long version of this since the train station on Christmas Eve, she said. Cotter looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he picked up his pencil. All right, he said. Let's go through everything one more time. The week before the hearing had its own particular texture, the feeling of ordinary life continuing on top of something large and unresolved, the way water runs over bedrock. Children went about their days. Danny lost a boot in the creek and had to walk back to the house with one sock and the philosophical outlook of a 6-year-old who has done worse. Lily memorized a poem that she recited at every meal, whether or not anyone had requested it. A poem about a bluebird that had 6 stanzas, and which Elena could now recite from memory by the 4th day. Ruth finished her book and started another one, and came to Elena on a Tuesday evening with a question about a word she didn't understand. And this opened into an hour-long conversation about the book that left Ruth with the look of someone who had been surprised by a person. Read a lot, Ruth said. I used to, Elena said. I was a teacher. What did you teach? Reading. Arithmetic, some history. She paused. I liked the reading best. Ruth considered her. Why did you stop? The school closed, Elena said. Town I was in got smaller. A lot of towns were getting smaller, back east. People were going west. She looked at Ruth, which is how I ended up here. Ruth thought about this with her characteristic seriousness. That seems like a bad reason to end up somewhere, she said. Most reasons are messier than they look in retrospect, Elena said. The important thing is usually what you do once you're there, not why you came. Ruth was quiet for a moment. I like having you here, she said. Came out quickly, with the precision of someone who has decided to say a thing before they could decide not to. I know I know it's been complicated for him, but I wanted you to know that. She went back to her book before Elena could respond. Elena looked at the top of Ruth's head, bent over the pages, felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for gratitude, and something sharper than gratitude, something that had to do with what it meant to be chosen by a 9-year-old who chose everything carefully. She went back to her mending and didn't say anything more, because some moments held more weight when you let them sit. Cole came to her the night before the hearing. It was late past 9, which was past when the younger children were in bed, and past when Cole himself was usually in his room. Elena was at the kitchen table with the account books and her copy of the contract and Cotter's summary of the arguments, going through it for the 4th or 5th time, because going through it again was the only productive thing she could think of to do with the anxiety that had been sitting in her chest since Monday. She heard his door, heard his feet in the hall, heard him stop outside the kitchen. Can't sleep either, she said without looking up. Pause. Then he came in and sat down at the other end of the table. He was in his socks and his heavy work shirt, and he had the look of someone who had been lying awake, thinking hard. Pa's nervous, Cole said. He doesn't show it the same way other people do. But I know what it looks like. I know, Elena said. So am I. What happens if it goes wrong tomorrow? She put down her pen. She had been through this question in her own head every night for a week, and she had arrived at the same answer each time, the honest one. The judge rules against us on the contract. Cotter appeals, she said. The appeal is slow. I may need to leave the ranch temporarily, not because I want to, but because staying while a legal case is active might create more problems for your father than it solves. And then we fight it through the courts until we win, or until we find something else that works. Cole absorbed this. Temporarily, he said. Yes, temporarily. He looked at the table. You know what temporarily means to me. She did know. She knew exactly what it meant to him, because he had told her not in words, but in the 8 weeks of careful distance and unlocked by degrees trust, and one conversation about a clothesline and one about cornmeal, and don't tell him I said anything, and the afternoon in the barn when. Said both in a voice smaller than he'd intended. Doesn't mean the same thing when you know why it's happening and you know the person is coming back, she said. How do you know you'd come back? Because I have nowhere else to be, she said. Gone because your family is, she stopped. Started again. This is my home. Even if a judge tries to complicate that for a while, it doesn't change what it is. Cole looked at her for a moment. The carefully maintained door was fully open. Now she could see him as he actually was. Not as he'd been presenting himself. Not the armor of capability and self-sufficiency, but a 12-year-old boy who missed his mother and had spent 8 months being so afraid of losing anyone else that he'd decided not to let anyone close enough to lose. Okay, he said. He said it the same way he'd said it in the barn. One word that meant considerably more than one word. Got up and went back to his room. Elena sat at the table for a moment, looking at the lamp flame, and then she went back to the contract summary and read it one more time and went to bed and lay in the dark for an hour thinking about what tomorrow held, and eventually slept. February 14th was a clear day, which felt almost impolite, the kind of bright Wyoming winter day that was so clean and cold it seemed to have opinions about itself. They rode into Coldwater Creek in the wagon, all 6 of them, because Wyatt had not wanted to leave the children with anyone, and because Elena had said they should come, and when he'd asked why, she'd said that a family arriving together looked different from a woman arriving alone, and he'd thought about it and agreed. Cotter was waiting outside the courthouse. He had with him a leather case and 2 folders, and the expression of a man who has prepared as well as the available materials allow, and is now in the phase of the work that depends on things other than preparation. He looked at the children in the wagon, and then at Elena with a slightly modified version of his usual expression. I didn't anticipate the audience, he said. They'll be in the hall, Elena said. Is that a problem? No, he said after a moment. Actually, no. They went inside. The courthouse in Coldwater Creek was a modest building that took itself seriously, the county seal above the door, the hard wooden benches, particular smell of official buildings everywhere, which is old paper and cold stone, and the accumulated weight of decisions. Judge Aldrich was already at the bench when they entered, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a face that had become, over a long career, professionally neutral. Looked at them when they came in, and his eyes passed over Elena, then Wyatt, then Cotter, then briefly to the older children filing into the back bench. Morse was at the other table, with a lawyer Elena hadn't seen before, younger than Cotter, with the look of someone who had recently been told this case was simpler than it apparently was. Driscoll sat in the gallery behind Morse, his coat folded on his knee, watching the room with the patience of a man who considers most situations manageable. The hearing began. Morse's lawyer opened with the contract, its terms, the agency's claim that Elena had violated them, the assertion that the notification of Thornton's withdrawal had been attempted through proper channels and that any failure of delivery was not the agency's legal responsibility. Smooth and precise, and took about 20 minutes. Cotter opened with the letter. He introduced it into evidence first before he said anything else about the case, because the letter was the thing and everything else built from it. He read the relevant section aloud in the flat, careful voice of a lawyer letting the document speak. Date of the letter. The date of Thornton's withdrawal. Gap between them. The nature of the letter, not a form letter, not an administrative confirmation, but a specific communication confirming Elena's travel arrangements down to the train number. Then he made his argument, which was not complicated and was not supposed to be. The agency had knowledge of the changed situation and proceeded anyway. Notification failure was not administrative error but operational choice. Contract was void at the moment Elena boarded the train because the agency had knowingly sent her toward a placement that no longer existed. Aldrich listened with the professional neutrality of his face fully in place. He asked 3 questions during Cotter's opening, each of which was precise enough to tell Elena that he was, whatever his tendencies, an intelligent man who was actually listening. Then Morse's lawyer responded. He challenged the letter on the grounds that the clerk who sent it had acted without Morse's authorization. He produced an affidavit from the clerk, the same young man Elena had spoken to on her first morning in town, stating that he had sent the letter in error, without checking the current status of the placement. The room was quiet for a moment. Cotter stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to question Mr. Morse directly on the management practices of the Westward Hearts Agency, specifically as they relate to correspondence authorization. Aldrich looked at Morse's lawyer, who objected on grounds that Morse was not the subject of the hearing. Cotter said that Morse's practices were directly relevant to the question of whether the notification failure was error or practice. Aldrich thought about it for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something, and then said, "I'll allow it." Called. He came to the stand with the same careful composure he brought to everything, and settled himself, and looked at Cotter with the expression of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and expects to manage this one. Cotter asked him about the agency's correspondence procedures. Who authorized outgoing letters? Whether the clerk had independent authority to send placement confirmations? What the review process was for active placements before communication went out? Morse's answers were technically careful and practically evasive, the kind of answers that contain no single lie but produce a false picture by what they don't include. Cotter let him build the picture, let him explain the procedure, let him establish in his own words, on the record, that the clerk did not have independent authority to send communications of consequence without review. Then Cotter asked, "Mr. Morse, you testified that the clerk sent this letter without authorization and without checking the placement status. Given the procedure you've just described, where does the review process break down to allow that to happen?" Morse began an answer about a particularly busy period in the office. On December 2nd of last year, Cotter said, the same clerk sent Miss Whitaker a letter confirming her travel arrangements. On November 11th, your office received Thornton's withdrawal, 21 days during which, under the procedure you've described, someone in a supervisory position reviewed outgoing correspondence. Did no one in your office review the December 2nd letter before it was sent? Morse's answer was careful. It was also not an answer. Aldrich noticed. Cotter moved on. He introduced the records from both prior cases, not testimony, not names, just dates and contract numbers, and the pattern of how each situation had progressed, obtained through county court records that were public. Laid them side by side with Elena's case. Placement failure. No notification. Woman stranded. Agency offer of alternative placement. Alternative placement connected to Driscoll. 3 times. Driscoll from the gallery had gone very still. Morse's lawyer objected that prior cases were not evidence of current conduct. Cotter said he was not arguing they were evidence of conduct, but evidence of a pattern that spoke to the question of whether this notification failure was error or practice. Aldrich sustained the objection formally, but his face had done something during the presentation of the pattern, a small tightening that meant he had seen it. Then Morse's lawyer called Elena. She had known this was coming, and had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by knowing exactly what she would say and saying it plainly without performance. Asked about the contract, about her understanding of her obligations, about whether she had made any effort to resolve the situation with the agency before leaving Coldwater Creek with Wyatt. She answered each question directly. When he asked about leaving with Wyatt, she said, "I left with Mr. Mercer because Mr. Morse had threatened to involve the county sheriff over a debt that did not legally exist, had offered me a forced remarriage to a man I had not chosen, and had made it clear that remaining in town without accepting his terms would have consequences. I left because I had been given no other safe option." Safe is a subjective term, Morse's lawyer said. Being threatened by a man with a history of stranding women in this county and then using their legal vulnerability to benefit a business partner is not subjective, Elena said. It's a description of events. Morse's lawyer opened his mouth. Aldrich held up a hand. "Move on," he said. It was a small moment. But it was something. Guy. When Elena stepped down and went back to the table, Wyatt was looking at the surface of the table in front of him with his jaw set, which meant he had been listening hard and did not trust his face to be entirely neutral about what he'd heard. Under the table, his hand was resting on the surface between them, not reaching for anything, just present. Elena looked at it for a moment. Then she put her hand next to his on the table, not touching, not a gesture, just in the same place. He didn't move his hand away. Aldrich called a recess at mid-morning. 30 minutes in the hall, wooden benches, the children who had been sitting in extraordinary stillness for 2 hours released to a slightly longer radius of movement. Danny immediately tried to slide on the stone floor, was stopped by Cole's hand on his collar. Lily sat next to Elena and leaned against her arm exactly as she had in the wagon on the first day, with the same settled confidence. Ruth sat on the other side of Elena and looked at the courthouse ceiling. How do you think it's going? Ruth said. Better than I expected, Elena said. Not as well as I'd like. What does Cotter think? You'd have to ask him. Ruth considered this. Then she got up and went to where Cotter was reviewing his folders at the end of the hall and stood next to him until he noticed her and asked if he could help her. She asked him, in the voice she used for questions she had considered in advance, how he assessed the probability of a favorable ruling. Cotter looked at her for a moment. About 60%, he said. 40 if Aldrich is more conservative than I think he's going to be. Ruth nodded and came back and reported this to Elena with accuracy. She's going to be formidable, Elena said to Wyatt quietly. I know, he said, she already is. A hearing reconvened. Cotter made his closing argument, which was structured and clear, and returned to the letter twice, and the pattern once, and ended with a statement about what contracts were for and what they became when one party used them as instruments of exploitation rather than agreement. Morse's lawyer made his closing, which was technically proficient and cast Elena as a woman who had violated her obligations and was now attempting to avoid the consequences. Aldrich sat for a moment with his hands folded on the bench. I'm going to take this matter under advisement, he said. I'll have a ruling within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Elena had understood this was possible. Cotter had warned her, but the weight of it settled on her chest in a specific way regardless. 2 more weeks of not knowing. 2 more weeks of Franklin Morse operating in the county without an answer. They filed out into the bright February cold. Wyatt helped Lily into the wagon. Danny was attempting to explain the hearing to the wagon horse, who was tolerating this with dignity. Ruth was quiet. Cole was standing at the wagon wheel looking at nothing in particular, and when Elena came to stand beside him, he looked at her. 60%, he said. He had apparently also heard Ruth's report. 60% is better than 50, she said. It's not 100. No, she said, it's not. He looked at the courthouse. What do you need to do while we wait? The question surprised her. It was an adult question, a practical one, asked by someone who had decided to be useful rather than afraid. She thought about it honestly. I need to make sure the land grant is properly recorded, she said. I need to write to Clara Voss and tell her where things stand. I need to help Cotter gather any additional documentation he might want for an appeal, in case it comes to that. She paused. And I need to keep the house running and the accounts current and help Danny with his multiplication tables because he has still not reliably memorized the sevens. Cole looked at her. And then, for the first time since Christmas Eve, since the train station, since the cold bench and the empty platform and the long weeks of everything that had followed, for the first time, in what felt like a very long journey towards something she couldn't yet see clearly, a 12-year-old boy who had decided not to need anything from anyone looked at her and smiled. Not the ghost of one, not the corner of the mouth almost. Real one, brief and genuine and young. I know my sevens, he said. I know you do, she said. You can help him. He climbed up into the wagon. Elena stood for a moment in the courthouse yard, in the February light. Don looked at the building they'd just come out of and thought about 60% and 2 weeks and all the ground that had shifted since a man named Franklin Morse had slapped a photograph down on a desk and said, she's nobody. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Wyatt, and he clicked the horses forward, and they drove home through the cold, bright afternoon. And the ranch came up out of the flat white land the way it always did all at once. Suddenly there, smoke from the chimney, the barn bigger than the house, the east pasture running out toward the creek under its cover of winter. Home. Not perfect, not finished, not free yet of the legal machinery that Morse had set in motion. But home in the way that mattered, the way that isn't about a deed or a contract or a judge's ruling, but about the particular quality of arriving somewhere and feeling the knot in your chest loosen, just slightly. Because this is the place where people know your name and mean it. She would have 2 weeks to live in that, and then whatever came next. She intended to be ready for it. The 2 weeks after the hearing had a specific kind of weight to them, not the sharp anxiety of the hearing itself, but something duller and more persistent, the way a bruise aches differently than a cut. Couldn't do anything with it. You could only live inside it and keep moving. Elena kept moving. She wrote to Clara Voss the day after the hearing. A straightforward letter describing what had happened in the courtroom, what Cotter had presented, and where things stood. She told Clara that her information had been useful even without her name in the record, and that she was grateful. She did not ask for anything more. Clara wrote back within 5 days a short letter, 3 paragraphs, the last of which said, "If the ruling goes wrong and you need me in front of a judge, I'll come. I wanted you to know that before you needed to ask." Elena read that paragraph 3 times and then folded the letter and put it with the others she was keeping the original travel confirmation. Morse's threat letter, Cotter's summary, account of the survey stakes in a tin box she'd found in the pantry that had previously held miscellaneous hardware. She showed it to Wyatt that evening. He read it and handed it back without comment, but his shoulders had dropped about half an inch, which on Wyatt Mercer was the equivalent of a long exhale. Land grant went to Hatchfield, with Wyatt on the Wednesday of the first week, properly certified through the Territorial Land Office's county representative, a process that took most of the day and required Wyatt to produce 2 additional documents he hadn't known he needed and had to ride back for, which added 3 hours and put him home after dark and in a mood that was not precisely bad but was compressed. Ate the meal Elena had kept warm without talking much, and then sat at the table afterward with his coffee and said, "It's done." And that was the full report. "Good," she said. "Cotter says the certification closes the survey argument," he said. "Driscoll's filing becomes legally incoherent once the grant is properly recorded." "That's one of the 2 problems," Elena said. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "One of them." They sat with the other one for a moment, unspoken, the way people who are living inside the same situation can sit with it together without having to name it every time. Then Danny appeared in the doorway in his nightclothes to report that Lily had taken his socks and refused to return them on the grounds that Clara needed them for warmth, which opened a 15-minute negotiation that Elena managed with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the goal was resolution rather than justice. John Wyatt watched this from his chair with an expression that had given up being compressed and become something considerably quieter and warmer. 9 days after the hearing, Cotter sent a message that Aldrich had reached his ruling and it would be delivered on Friday morning. Thursday night, Elena could not sleep. She lay in the narrow room and listened to the ranch settle into its winter sounds and thought about everything that could happen and what each version meant and what she would do. She had been over it enough times that the thinking had become more ritual than analysis, a way of holding the anxiety by giving it shape. About 2 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the hall. Not a child's adult weight, moving quietly. They stopped outside her door. The light knock. "Yes, it's me," Wyatt said. Through the door, his voice at low volume. "Come in." He opened the door and stood in the frame. Not coming fully in, his lamp held low. He had the look of someone who had also not been sleeping, which she had expected. "I wanted to say something before tomorrow," he said. "All right." He looked at the lamp for a moment. He was a man who chose words carefully, not because he was calculating, but because he was genuinely trying to say the right thing, and the trying was sometimes slow. "Whatever Aldrich rules tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that this house is your home. I know," Cotter said, "there might be a period where it's strategically better for you to be somewhere else if the ruling goes wrong. And I understand that argument, but I want you to hear from me, not from the legal logic that you are." He stopped. Started again. "You belong here, that's what I wanted to say." Elena sat in the dark and looked at him in the lamplight. This tired, careful man who had stopped a wagon on a January morning for reasons he probably couldn't have fully articulated at the time, and had been living with the consequences of that decision every day since, and had not once, not in a single moment that she could identify, behaved as though he regretted it. "I know," she said. "Thank you for saying it out loud." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer, not the sideways glance she'd grown familiar with, but directly, the way people look at each other when they are deciding something, or have already decided it, and are just acknowledging it. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. He pulled the door closed. "Gaw." She lay back down and looked at the ceiling, and thought that whatever happened in the morning, this moment existed, and nothing that happened afterward could take it back. And that was a fact. She could hold on to the way you hold on to something real when everything else is uncertain. She slept. They were at the courthouse by 8. Cotter was already there, which meant he had probably been there since 7, which was the kind of thing Cotter did. He had the leather case and the folders, and an additional document Elena hadn't seen before, and when she asked about it, he said, "Background from Agnes Fulton." Not testimony. A written account she agreed to have me carry as reference material. He paused. "Martha Ellison is very persuasive, I know," Elena said. Children were in the hall again. The same positions as before, Danny immediately attempting to slide on the floor, stopped by Cole, Lily beside Elena with Clara, Ruth with her book that she was reading with the particular focus of someone who is not actually thinking about the book. Wyatt stood near the door to the courtroom with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the carefully nothing expression he used when he was working hard at something internal. Elena stood beside him. She did not touch his arm or say reassuring things, because she had known him long enough to understand that reassurance was not what he needed. He needed company that didn't require him to perform. 8:30, the bailiff called them in. Aldrich was at the bench already. Morse was at his table with his lawyer. Driscoll was in the gallery again. Something was different today. He was sitting slightly forward rather than back, and his coat was not folded on his knee but clutched in his lap, which was the first time Elena had seen anything about him that looked like something other than controlled certainty. She filed in with Wyatt and Cotter and sat down. Aldrich looked at his papers for a moment. He looked at both tables. He had the face of a man who had made a decision he was clear about, which was distinguishable from a man who was about to deliver a decision he was uncomfortable with. And in the first few seconds, Elena read which it was and felt something in her chest unlock by a fraction. In the matter of the Westward Hearts Marriage Agency versus Miss Elena Whitaker, Aldrich began. I have reviewed all submitted evidence, contract in question, and the arguments presented by both parties. Paused, in the manner of judges who understand that pauses do work. Central question before this court is whether the contract between the agency and Miss Whitaker was breached, and if so, by which party. He looked at the documents in front of him. The evidence establishes clearly that the Westward Hearts Agency received notice of Mr. Thornton's withdrawal from the placement agreement on November 11th of last year. The evidence further establishes that on December 2nd, 21 days after receiving that notice, the agency sent Miss Whitaker a communication confirming her travel arrangements, as though the placement were still active. Morse's lawyer shifted in his chair. The agency's explanation that this communication was sent in error by an unauthorized clerk is not consistent with the testimony regarding the agency's own described procedures, Aldrich continued. Under those procedures, outgoing correspondence of this nature required supervisory review. No explanation has been offered for how this letter cleared that review process, if it was, as claimed, an unauthorized error. He looked up briefly. Is the ruling of this court that the contract between the Westward Hearts Marriage Agency and Miss Elena Whitaker was voided by the agency's failure to provide timely and accurate notification of the material change to the placement. Miss Whitaker is not in breach of her contractual obligations. Agency's claim against her is dismissed. The gallery was quiet for a moment, and it wasn't. Morse's face had done a specific thing, not collapse, not rage, but the tightening of a man who had expected a different outcome and was now rapidly recalculating. His lawyer was writing something. Driscoll had leaned back in his chair, with the controlled stillness of a man who has lost one thing and is deciding how much it costs him relative to everything else he's holding. Aldrich waited for the murmur to settle. Additionally, he said, and the word brought the room back to silence, because a judge saying additionally after a ruling means the ruling is not finished. Court has noted the documentary evidence regarding the pattern of placement failures associated with this agency and the subsequent involvement of Mr. Driscoll in the resulting situations. This court does not have before it a case against Mr. Driscoll or the agency for any criminal or civil fraud. However, the pattern as documented is of sufficient concern that I am referring the matter to the county attorney's office for review. Driscoll's stillness became a different kind of stillness. With respect to the boundary survey filing on the Mercer property east pasture, Aldrich went on. Court finds that the 1,876 territorial grant, now properly certified and recorded, establishes the boundary definitively. County Surveyor's Office is directed to close the competing filing. Any future boundary dispute regarding this property must be brought with documentation that addresses the territorial grant directly. He looked at Driscoll's side of the gallery. A filing that does not do so will be dismissed without hearing. Gathered his papers. This matter is concluded. Court is adjourned. He stood. The bailiff called it. And then it was over, not slowly, not with build-up. The way important moments often ended up being just a man standing up, and the sound of papers, and the creak of the bench, and the thing that had been hanging over her head since Christmas Eve was gone. Elena sat for a moment without moving. Cotter was writing. Wyatt had uncrossed his arms. From the hallway she could hear Lily's voice asking Ruth something, and Ruth's voice answering, and Danny making a sound that suggested he had successfully slid on the floor this time without Cole's intervention. She looked at the table in front of her. The tin box of documents wasn't there. She'd left it at the ranch, but she could feel the shape of it in her mind, the weight of everything she'd been carrying and keeping and building an argument from, and the particular sensation of setting something heavy down. Wyatt put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't say anything. Just left it there, solid and warm and certain, the hand of a man who worked with his hands and knew what it was to hold things that mattered. Upped. She turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying that the moment wasn't already saying better. Morse left Coldwater Creek within the month. This was not immediate and not dramatic. He simply was there, and then was less there, and then his office had a different sign in the window and a different name on the door. A woman who ran a legitimate land-finding service for families moving west, and who had, Elena would later learn, specifically chosen the location because the previous tenant's departure had made it available at a favorable rate. Westward Hart's marriage agency dissolved quietly, which was the way things built on fraud tended to dissolve not with confrontation but with the gradual removal of the conditions that had allowed them to exist. County Attorney's Office opened a review into the agency's practices. Elena gave a deposition in March, Clara Voss gave one in April, and Agnes Fulton through Martha Ellison, as intermediary, provided a written account that she did not have to deliver in person. Elena never learned the full outcome of that process, because legal reviews were slow and the information filtered back in fragments over months. What she did learn, the following autumn, was that Driscoll had sold 3 properties and relocated to a different county, and that the East Pasture and its creek access remained fully and uncontestably part of the Mercer Ranch. She learned this last part from Wyatt, who told her on an evening in October when the light was going gold through the kitchen window and she was doing the accounts and he was at the table reading the letter from Cotter that contained the final notation on the boundary case. He read it and set it down and looked at it for a moment. "Done," he said. "Both things," she said. "Both things," he said. She kept writing in the account book. He kept looking at the letter. Outside, the autumn sounds of the ranch came through the window, Cole's voice in the yard, directing one of the new hands they'd taken on in the spring, when the workload had gotten ahead of what 2 people and 4 children could manage. Danny's boots on the porch, the horses in the corral. "I need to ask you something," Wyatt said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the directness he used when he had made a decision and was committed to it, not testing the water but walking in. "I know things are settled now," he said. "The legal situation. The land. You're free to do whatever you want to do next." He paused. "I don't want you to stay because it's where you ended up. I want you to stay because you choose to." He paused again. "And I want to know if you'd be willing to choose it. Choose this. Officially." He said the last word with the slight awkwardness of a man who knows what he means and is not entirely sure his words are landing the right way. "Marry me. If that's something you want." Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a train station and a cold bench and a photograph of a man who never came. She thought about 43 cents and a suitcase and a woman who had crossed 840 miles looking for a place that would have her. She thought about how the place she'd found was nothing like the place she'd imagined, and how it had turned out to be far more than she'd known to want. "Wyatt," she said, "I reorganized your entire pantry in the first week." He looked at her. "Yeah, I took over your accounting system without being asked." "I know. I told a county surveyor to pull stakes on your property." "I remember. I've been choosing this," she said, "since about the 3rd day. I just needed you to ask me." He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his face, not a dramatic change, not a performance of happiness, but a slow settling, a particular expression of a person who has been carrying tension they'd stopped noticing and has just realized it's gone. "That's a yes," he said. "That's a yes," she said, reached across the table and took her hand. And she let him. And they sat in the October kitchen in the slanted gold light, with the sounds of their family coming through the open window. The accounting book stayed open on the table between them, and neither of them moved for a long time. They were married in December, almost exactly 1 year after Elena had arrived at the cold train station with 43 cents and a suitcase and a fragile, specific hope that had not yet learned what shape it was supposed to take. Ceremony was small. Cotter came. Martha Ellison came with her patient grandson, who had grown approximately 4 inches since January, and a few ranch neighbors, and the 4 children who had varying reactions to the occasion. Lily wore her best dress and held Clara with enormous ceremony. Danny managed to stay clean for 45 minutes before an encounter with the yard's mud situation reduced this to approximately the level expected. Ruth wore her serious face for the first part and then, somewhere in the middle, stopped wearing it, not replaced by anything performative. Just the natural expression of a 9-year-old who has decided that what is happening is genuinely good. Cole stood beside his father during the short ceremony, in the position that would in some contexts be called best man, though no one used that term. 13 now, taller by 2 inches than he'd been in January, with the beginning of the angularity that would eventually resolve into someone who looked very much like Wyatt, but with his mother's eyes. He did not cry, because he was 13 and had his father's stubborn composure. But when it was done and Elena and Wyatt had said what they needed to say, and the thing was settled, came to stand beside Elena with the air of someone completing a commitment they'd made privately a long time ago. "I moved the cornmeal to the right last week," he said. Elena looked at him. "I noticed," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. Then, with the careful precision of a 13-year-old who has decided a thing is worth doing, even if it's uncomfortable, put his arm briefly around her shoulders, not a hug. Not quite. More like a bracket, an acknowledgement, and then stepped back and went to stand with the ranch hands who had come up from the bunkhouse for the occasion and pretended to be very interested in the conversation they were having. Martha Ellison appeared at Elena's elbow. "He's a good boy," she said. "He's an exceptional boy," Elena said. Martha made her sound of agreement. She looked at the yard, the people, the light, the house with smoke coming from both chimneys, because Elena had lit the parlor fire for the occasion. "I've been watching this town for 50 years, she said. "I've seen people build things that should have worked and fall apart, and I've seen things that looked like disaster turn into something worth having." She paused. "This is the second kind." "I know," Elena said. "Good," Martha said. "Don't forget it on the hard days." She took her coffee and went to talk to Cotter, who received her with the expression of a man who has learned that Martha Ellison's company, while sometimes alarming, was generally worthwhile. Spring came to the Mercer Ranch the way it always came to Wyoming late, and suddenly the snow releasing its hold on the ground in a week of wet, consistent warmth that left the mud deep and the pastures impossibly green in the first light of May mornings. Elena stood on the porch with her coffee in those early mornings and watched the east pasture come back to life, grass growing toward the creek that was still and always theirs. The boundary line settled now in paper and in law and in the deeper, uncontestable way of things that have simply been decided. She had not become someone else over the course of the year. That was important to say, because the story of a woman finding a home could easily become the story of a woman being remade by it, softened or simplified or resolved into something more manageable than what she actually was. That wasn't what happened. She was still the woman who read contracts 4 times before signing them and argued with county surveyors and kept the account books with a precision that occasionally made Wyatt look at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as the specific admiration of a practical man for someone who is better at a practical thing than he is. She was still the woman who woke sometimes in the deep of the night, thinking about all the ways things could have gone differently, not with regret, not with fear, but with the particular alertness of someone who had been through a narrow passage and hadn't fully stopped being surprised to be on the other side. She was still the woman who had sat on a cold bench on Christmas Eve with 43 cents and the knowledge that the world had decided she was nobody and had looked at that knowledge and disagreed. What was different was that she had a place to put herself, a kitchen that was organized the way she'd organized it, a family that ate meals at a table with 6 chairs, none of which matched anymore, because Danny had broken 2 and they'd replaced them with what was available. A bedroom down the hall that was no longer the narrow stranger's room, but hers, theirs, with the window facing east that she'd come to depend on for the quality of early morning light it provided. A set of people who expected her to be there, and whose expectation had nothing afraid in it, nothing contingent, nothing that said for now, or unless, or as long as you behave like what we need you to be. Just expectation. Just you live here, you are ours and we are yours. The whole of it. There was a lesson in what had happened to her, though she was wary of drawing it too cleanly, the way hard-won things resist the lessons that try to summarize them. If she had to name what she'd come to understand, lying on that narrow bed in the ranch's east room in the first weeks, listening to the Wyoming wind working at the corners of the house, it was this: being left is not the same as being nobody. She had sat in that train station, and the world had told her she was unclaimed, unimportant, a failed transaction. And she had disagreed. Not loudly, not all at once. Not without fear. She had been afraid most of the time. Through most of it, but persistently. She had kept insisting, in the small daily ways of getting up and trying the next door, and reading the contract again, and writing the letter, and showing up at the courthouse, and moving the cornmeal to where it made sense, that she was a person of consequence who was owed decent treatment, and who intended to build something real with whatever she was given to work with. The world eventually had agreed with her. Not because the world was just, it was not, reliably, just but because she had made the case long enough and loud enough, and with enough evidence that the case became undeniable. You cannot always force the world to be fair, but you can refuse to accept unfairness as the final word. And the refusal, repeated enough times, in enough small ways, accumulates into something that looks like courage and functions like a home. One afternoon in late May, Elena was in the kitchen garden, finally replanted, finally productive. The root vegetables coming up in the section she'd turned over in March, when she heard the wagon on the road and looked up to see Wyatt coming back from town with the children, who had gone in for supplies, and apparently for the acquisition of something Danny was holding at arm's length with the expression of someone managing a situation. It was a frog, a large one. Absolutely not in the house, Elena said before the wagon had fully stopped. It's for scientific study, Danny said. It's for the creek, Elena said. Caw said, I said we'd see, Wyatt said, which was the answer of a man who had learned when to delay and when to decide. Lily climbed down and came immediately to the garden to inspect the progress of the vegetables, which she tracked with a proprietary interest that had begun in March when Elena had let her plant the first row. Ruth came with her book and sat on the garden fence and read. Cole helped Wyatt with the horses, the two of them moving through the task with the easy economy of people who have done something together enough times that it no longer required discussion. Elena watched all of it from the middle of the garden, with her hands full of dirt and the sun at a May angle that was finally warm enough to deserve the name. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train 7 months ago with a suitcase and a hope and arrived in a town that didn't want her. That woman had known how to survive. She had not known yet how to belong somewhere. Belonging, it turned out, was not a condition that was granted to you. It was not something you found waiting, like a room with your name on it. It was something you built, slowly and imperfectly, out of the daily materials of showing up and being useful, and fighting for your right to stay and making the meals and doing the accounts, and sewing the button back onto the doll, and moving the cornmeal to the right place, and standing in the street. Saying no, when everything around you is saying yes, accept what you're given. You have no other options. You built it the way ranchers built houses on the Wyoming plain, not with elegance, not all at once. Starting with what you had, reinforcing against the weather, knowing it would hold if you did the work. Elena, Lily said, very seriously, can the frog live in the garden? It eats the bugs and stays out of my carrots, Elena said. Lily turned and reported this to Danny with the gravity of a treaty being conveyed. Danny considered the terms. The frog offered no opinion. Wyatt came around the side of the house and stopped at the garden fence. Looked at the scene, his children, the garden, the frog negotiation, with the expression he had when things were good, and he was allowing himself to know it. Looked at Elena. She met his eyes across the garden. It was a whole year in that look. Christmas Eve and the wagon and the kitchen at midnight and the courthouse and October light and all of it, the whole accumulated weight of a year of choosing to be here, laid quietly between two people who had both been, in their different ways, alone for a long time before they were not. How's the garden? He said. Good, she said. The tomatoes are coming. Cole said the east fence line needs checking this week. Can wait until Tuesday, she said. I need him to help me with the accounts Monday. I can do the accounts, Wyatt said. You can do them, she agreed pleasantly. Cole does them better, and he needs to learn the system so we have a backup when I'm not available. Wyatt looked at her. When are you not available? I don't know yet, she said. But a ranch this size should have 2 people who know the numbers. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the look that was not quite a smile but was very close to one. All right, he said. Tuesday for the fence. D. He went up onto the porch and took off his coat and sat in the chair that had been there before Elena came and which now had a cushion on it because she had made one in February during the weeks of waiting. He picked up the newspaper from town that he hadn't had time to read yet, and the frog negotiation reached its conclusion. And Ruth read her book on the fence. And the tomatoes came up toward the May sun, with the stubborn, necessary insistence of growing things. Elena turned back to the garden and put her hands back in the earth and thought, this is it. Not a grand thing, Not a perfect thing, a real thing which is better. Woman arrived in Wyoming on Christmas Eve with nothing. She was left. And she disagreed with what that meant about her. And she kept disagreeing. Day after day, in the small and the large ways that were available to her. She found people who were also, in their own ways, putting themselves back together. And she built something with them that none of them could have built alone. Train station still stands in Coldwater Creek. Cold bench is still there, the same wood, the same lamps. But the woman who sat on it is gone. Not because she left, because she was replaced by someone who knows where she lives, who knows the names of her children, who knows which fence needs checking Tuesday, who knows that the tomatoes are coming. She is home. Not the home she crossed 840 miles to find, the one she built.